And as soon as I say that, it finally works. Sorry about that. I don't know what was going on, but I tried like 3 times, and YouTube was sort of spinning its wheels, trying to go live. And then it's like, nope, we can't go live right now. Try again, which was grayed out, or finish. And so I clicked finish, and I tried again. And after like 4th attempt, it finally worked. So, but I was also a few minutes late, and let you know. So, hello, Lynn Toy Train Museum. Is this, so are you the guy I talked to last time, Daniel Staub, or are you a different UMass person? Also, which books? Yeah, I was thinking when I scheduled this, I would do it out on my front deck because it's like I like being out there in the morning. And then I realized if I go 2 hours like I did last time, this is like the worst time of day, and I'd have to do it at like, I would have to do it at like maybe 7 a.m., which would be like people Pacific time would be 5 a.m. I mean, this is already like 7 for people in the Pacific time zone. But I also finally did something about very cheap solution, but I can completely cover the camera if I need to step away, which I'm not using any fancy streaming software. So do you work at this place, the Lynn Toy Train Museum? I don't think I've been to a toy train museum, but there was in Pennsylvania, there's something called the Lackawanna Trolley Museum, which I seem to recall being cool, but I don't remember anything about now. I might read something with, okay, here we are. And last time I was reading from Idris Shah Reflections until I had more questions. This is a good one, pen names. From time to time, I have had occasion to tell people that I write under names other than my own, pen names. Can you believe that in at least 9 instances out of 10, after hearing this, that person has said, "Indeed? And what are your pen names?" This is a good illustration of the almost complete automatism of much thinking. If people write under pseudonyms, it is surely because they do not want their real name to be known as attached to their writing. Why then would such a person be likely to tell anyone else what that pen name was? This was all the more remarkable because the people reacting this way were almost always strangers comparatively, people who would be supposedly less likely than close friends to receive such confidences. Which is interesting. It reminds me of I don't know if any of you, some of you might have seen made at least 2 videos talking about the idea of the anti-library from the Black Swan, where Umberto Eco, so he has a library of, in one place it's 30,000 books, in another place 10,000. I think I talked about this in another video because someone said I should watch his tour video, and I meant to do that, and then afterwards I forgot. I'm remembering now. But so he would get the question, hey, how many of these books have you read? And Taleb said, well, that's not the point. The point of the anti-library is to remind you of what you don't know, but also, for me, it's the opportunity of having the information at my fingertips. Anyways, let's see. So channel is for my Better Group Home Development Project. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I changed the contact email on my website because the default, the one that I was using with my personal address, just so many technical issues. So I just using the Gmail address now. Which books did you read because of my channel, out of curiosity, if you don't mind sharing? Another quick one. Exaggeration. Exaggeration is a standard peculiarity of man. To deprecate is often a form of exaggeration which people do not notice because it appears to be the opposite. And that one is particularly salient for me because I've realized, so something you learn about depression is depression makes you really bad at self-deception in the upward direction. But something I realized I was doing is deceiving myself about myself and my capabilities in the downward direction, because that depression seems to be basically a mechanism to make you not keep challenging the top monkey. And no one's going to think you're challenging the top monkey if you're deceiving yourself in the downward direction. And so I've realized true humility requires not just what we think of as avoiding like arrogance or overconfidence and hubris, but also about avoiding false modesty. I feel like if I buy books, I need to read them. I like the idea, but of an anti-library, but as an anti-consumerist cringes at the idea. I immediately need to reframe those books as need to read. Yeah, I think it depends. I very much am just a maximalist by nature, but oh, awesome. Yeah, I think I mentioned I started to reread that book, and I got 4 chapters in, and then I put it down. But I do want to reread it. I might actually. I'm trying to decide on the nominees for the next book club. Because you haven't. Anyone who's on this live stream has probably seen one of my announcements that it's going to be Saturday the 29th at 2 p.m., which won in the poll overwhelmingly. If it had been closer, I probably would have done Saturday the 5th at 9 a.m. because that's when one of my Patreon supporters, the only time they can make it. And it is also like I like doing this stuff early, which is why I'm doing a live stream at 9 a.m. as opposed to 2. But I also was free on Saturday afternoon on the 29th, so I put that as an option. So what book am I reading on the mail? Oh yeah, this is Reflections by Idries Shah, which yeah, its title is hard to read in this version. I got this like right in the start of the pandemic. I was interested in the Nasruddin stories. And so the Nasruddin is like a folkloric character from the Turco-Persian tradition, but he has also been absorbed because the Turco-Persian tradition spread to India. Like as far as India, they tell these stories. And then also he's been absorbed into Jewish culture as Juha. And he's a wise fool, somewhat of a trickster character, but mostly more of a wise fool archetype. And I was really fascinated by the Nasruddin stories, and Idries Shah was the foremost collector of these folk tales. And so I, like in the pandemic, I looked up because I realized they had like these nice little special editions of the Nasruddin hardcovers. And then although I realized they're still not as nice necessarily as the old Octagon Press books. So he ran this press called Octagon Press, and then he did and then when he died, his estate closed Octagon Press and started the Idries Shah Foundation, which mostly offers the books print on demand, but they did these special editions. And when I was looking, they were out of the special editions of a lot, so I got 5 of his books. This was one of them, which are, it turns out these are perfect bound, so it's not, kind of defeats the point of a hardcover like normally that be perfect bound, although it's still more convenient. It's more durable with how much I carry this book around, so I'm glad I got it. Let's see. So, okay. Hi, Kyle. Thank you. Yep. Yeah. It was weird because like the last couple of his birthdays, I don't think were as weird, but this one would have been his 70th. Also, I was gonna do something on my blog and something on Twitter, but I got myself temporarily banned on Twitter by making a joke so bad that the AI bot was very confident it was spam. Let's see. And I would have liked to do done the live stream, but I also did. There's a book club that I do at the same time that I could have done it in the evening, and obviously weekdays, people are going to be at work. Let's see. Books you'd recommend on the whole topic of the mind-body problem. Let's see. Obviously, I've been meaning to read The Master and the Emissary, but that's more about the division of the brain internally. So Arthur Koestler's Ghost in the Machine, which I keep referencing, which I'm a little bit worried because it's out of print and it was a popular book, but I'm a little bit worried the amount I reference it could drive up the price because I've seen other channels, although they've been more popular than mine, but like I seem to have driven Michael Polanyi's Logic of Liberty out of print briefly, although fortunately it's print on demand, so it came back, that I might end up driving up the used prices of Ghost in the Machine because for some reason it's out of print. Like a lot of his novels are still in print, and then Active Creation is still in print, but for some reason, anyways, Ghost in the Machine, like that sound, we use it usually talk about the mind-body problem. This one is more about he's introducing this idea of sort of this, what he calls holarchy, like a form of sort of inclusive modularity as a way that intelligence might arise, basically, which isn't quite the same answer. I mean, for me, the thing is I assume that I tend to assume there's not really a mind-body problem. I tend to assume that consciousness arises ultimately out of physical interactions, even if we can't like do it. Like it's a materialist thing. And specifically, I think that it's basically consciousness arose as a way to, in so complex individualized social species, it arose as a way to sort of evaluate ourselves and others in relation to others and sort of evaluate and question what we're doing. And like the next step of that is beyond that. So consciousness is just sort of thinking about things. Then you have metacognition as well, sort of a step beyond that. And so books on metacognition, I don't know what there might be. I learned about it in undergrad and sort of absorbed the topic from class. And then I haven't really found books on the topic. I haven't gone looking for them. Let's see. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll think of something later, but right now I'm not thinking of anything obvious that would address the mind-body problem. The two closest things I can come are Master and the Emissary, which I haven't read, but which I think is more about the vision of the brain. Although actually, when I was in undergrad, I read a book by Ramachandran, V.S. Ramachandran, who is famous for doing work on the phantom limb phenomenon, which I don't know if that's quite what you're interested in, but it's basically if you look at, so I think it's the cheek. So like if you look at the map of the sensory cortex, like the hands are next to the cheek, I think. And so if you have someone who's lost their hand, they will often feel phantom pain in the hand that doesn't exist. And so you can treat that by having them put the hand in a box so it's mirrored, so it looks, the other hand in a box so it's mirrored, so it looks like it's there. And then you stroke their cheek and it feels like you're massaging the pain away, basically. But I don't remember which book it was, but that might be relevant. Let's see. Okay, interesting. So these are books that you looked into or you read because of the channel, but not books that I recommended. Let's see. Interesting. I'll have to make a note of these. Well, I think I have it. YouTube always automatically doesn't do the chat replay, and you have to click to keep it. And I try to remember to do that. I think I did it with this one, hopefully. But so let's see. So thank you. Wishing me happy birthday to my late father. Red Zapfi and what he said about consciousness. No, that name is not even familiar. I'm going to quickly Google that. Because it's increasingly rare that someone references a name that sounds relevant to me, but not someone who is familiar. Okay, so Norwegian philosopher. Okay, yeah, antinatalism I very much internalized as a kid and had to get out of, but it doesn't mean everything else is wrong. I've still, like, Peter Singer's Expanding Circle is still on my TBR, even though I think he's wrong. And I've always had like an intuition, something seems wrong about his thinking from what I've heard, but I couldn't really articulate it like in the framework of what I'd learned. So let's see. So yeah. Can you tell us more about your father? So my father, he was born in Maine. I'm not sure exactly where, but he grew up in South China. His father was he had been in the Navy during the Korean War, and then he'd been in the Merchant Marine during the Korean War, and then he joined the Navy. I don't remember, sorry, but and then he went to MIT, got a degree in computer science, and then he got interested in AI stuff, and so he did his PhD thesis on computer vision at UMass Amherst, and he actually took off a year from his PhD program to raise me. So his PhD program took 11 years, but it really took 10 years because he took a year off to raise me, which I think my mother always kind of preferred my brother, and I think part of it is that she was the one raising my brother in his first year. My father was the one raising me. My parents would always be like, I was my father's kid and my brother was my mother's kid, and like very explicit about that. And so he like was in various like tech companies. He eventually, until his death, was working at a company called Lexalytics, which was doing semantic web stuff. He had a lot of interests in a lot of different topics, most of which overlap me, but some of which are things that I would like to be interested in, but I'm just not. Like, he did a lot of robotics stuff, and he actually, at the local middle school, high school, like combined school in my hometown, ran a robotics club for several years, I think up until the pandemic, and then sort of, I don't think he restarted after the pandemic went over, where he like helped these middle and high school students learn to do robotics. And he did a lot of stuff with robotics, and also he got really into 3D printing. But thank you. Let's see. Evolution as a mistake. Interesting. I definitely, one thing I've been wondering about is it seems like complex like cybernetic systems have a tendency to like drive towards ever greater complexity. And then you have countervailing forces that seem to make the systems worse and sort of go against that drive. And it's something like, this is a complicated thing that I want to make videos on, but I've had to figure out how to like break it down, and might do blog posts first too. Let's see, make sure I'm catching everything because I've been talking a bit. So, so Daniel Stobe recommended, I'll just read out his recommendation. He recommended, so a memoir by F. LaGard Smith titled God Before Me, God Behind Me, Pivotal Moment Shaping a Spiritual Journey. A book by Dan Coe titled The Art of Focus, Find Meaning, Reinvent Yourself, and Create Your Ideal Future. So the next one. So can you tell us more about your father? So I did talk a bit about that. And if there's a pause, I'll talk more about him. And yeah, so yeah, intelligence being a disability or well, excessively high intelligence. Have you heard of the electric Kool-Aid acid test? That's I have not. Electric Kool-Aid acid test. Oh, it's a nonfiction book by, okay, I've heard of Tom Wolfe, but I haven't heard of this particular book. He's an interesting cultural critic, and I've been trying to read more cultural critics. Interesting. So this person's saying that Ian McGilchrist's newest books are word salad mixed with political religious opinion. Just confusing, which is interesting because I have a friend who is probably like outside of the book clubs, the person I know who is closest to reading as much as I do. And she has been telling me, she was trying to get me to read Master and Emissary. I'm like, yeah, I will. It's on my TBR. I'll get to it at some point. And then she was like, hey, actually forget about Master and Emissary. Read his newest. It's like a 2-book set. Like this is just way beyond, like it's awesome. And I don't think I've even bought it yet because it's like $60 for the 2-book set. But so let's see. What are your thoughts on ableism within the neurodivergent community? So I see sort of 2 trends. Well, like at least I not really engage with the neurodivergent community like as a political activism thing. I'm doing some stuff with the Autism Society of Texas. I'm on the board of the adult advisory panel, and I'm in the process of starting a support group for autistic adults in the Bay Area, the Texas Bay Area, Galveston Bay Area. So if you happen to know anybody who's in the Galveston Bay Area of Texas, you can refer them to the Autism Society of Texas website. It should be up. I need to get a confirmation from the library about the room booking, and then they will be announcing it. But anyways, but that's, that's different, very different than like sort of self-organized neurodivergent communities. And those tend to be people dominated by people who were so minimally impaired that they didn't get diagnosed until they were adults, sort of ranting about the privilege of early diagnosis, which thing is, I am someone who in most of history and probably most times and places, at least like, or even most other places, like when I was diagnosed, there is a good chance I would have been diagnosed with ADHD or nothing. Like I've always been fairly high functioning. Like my father and grandfather were pretty obviously similar, but never got diagnosed. However, my mother's mother too. I'm not sure what my mother's father is. My father's mother definitely was not. But anyways, so like these people, they're very high functioning, and they're like, oh, this is great. Like this explains something about me. And I'm like, okay, great. But also like you still were able to sort of live a normal life with like minimal impairment. And then they sort of do these things about how, oh, autism is a superpower and all this stuff that is, no, and it's not acknowledging like the reality of even a lot of people who would still be classified like level 1 ASD still struggle a lot. And level 2 and 3 gets particularly hard, especially if you don't have a supportive family. And then conversely, you have, and this is less a thing in the autism or the neurodivergent space, but you have, meaning to write a post about, I think a lot of disabled people, especially the people who become disability activists, are basically, they're capable of doing a job, but they need accommodations that employers don't like granting because they're the kind of accommodations that then everybody would want. And so they're like, we don't want to grant these, combined with being often structurally hard to hire. And I'm kind of in that boat myself, although I have held work, and I'm just I can't really get to I can't really get even to the interview stage generally unless I, have some sort of in like with a neurodiversity hiring program, it seems like, or like someone who knows me, which, but even then, like I had an interview from a coworker who really liked working with me, and I blew that because slow processing speeds. So long that was a story. Like she was like, "Hey, we need this," and I'm like, "Well, I haven't done this," and she's like, "Hey, but we need this out. Like this is what we're trying to do." And I was like, "Wait, I haven't done exactly what she said, but I've done like what she's saying we need to do. I can do that." And by the time I realized that, she was already thanking me for my time, and I couldn't like interject, and so I sort of blew that interview. But anyway, sorry, this is getting off in the weeds. So a lot of these people are sort of similar boat where if it was easier to get hired, and if employers are willing to accommodate what they needed, they could easily work, but they can't. And so a lot of them end up basically like making big things out of petty grievances. I also, when I was in high school, I joined like the sort of first wave of like neurodivergent activist communities, and one of them was the bigger one that's still around, which is Wrong Planet, and I couldn't relate to those people. And then there was another one that was smaller that I could relate to, but I sort of was weirded out because the people running it were an English couple who wanted to build an autistic, who wanted to, they were an English couple who wanted to build an autistic ethno state in Wales. And so it was, I ended up like dropping out of that one as a teenager because that was, well, more people I liked, but I didn't like the people running it. Anyway, let's see, let me catch up to, um, yeah, focus on the social science and perhaps tech. So yeah, so I'm focused on, so yeah, this comment's asking, my video is focused on the social sciences and sometimes tech. What other fields do I enjoy reading? So yeah, so I have been sort of focusing on stuff that seems to do relatively well, sort of adjacent to stuff I've already discussed. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and I've done videos on those. They don't do as well. And so the only one that did kind of well was my one on world building, like connecting it to like political science and history. And so I'm like, okay, and the reason I was even thinking to try that is because Feral Historian had jumped onto my channel Overlap and been there for over a month, which I was thrilled about. And so, and then I like reading like religious studies type books. So that's still, I guess, sort of social science adjacent. Let's see. I'm interested in a lot of geometry type stuff as well as probability and statistics, although again, probability and statistics is often closely entwined with the social sciences, but like geometry really isn't. I'm interested in art. I'm really interested in like animals and like natural history. And that's another thing is like I've noticed my videos on like animal topics tend not to do very well. So till I can sort of figure out how to integrate those. Well, I do want to do my first two Houston Nerd Nights talks as like recorded videos, which are, so the first one was basically comparing human like cognitive and behavioral development to that of the Kia parrot of New Zealand, which we diverged from about 330 million years ago. But there's a lot of convergent evolution, I think, and it's a good model for sort of understanding humans. And I don't know how that would do, especially originally I was going to just do like my Nerd Nights talk, but I was going to like record it. And at this point, like it's been so long, I'd have to sort of reconstruct what I did anyways. So I might change it up a bit, try to rework it for a YouTube video. But in general, like my animal videos don't do as well. I'm interested in like botany and horticulture. I haven't been gardening because in Texas, well, I was thinking, oh, Texas, like long season, I could do it like late at night, early in the morning. But even then, the weather is typically too hot and humid for me to want to be out. So I put in some shrubs, and then the drought killed half of them. And then I hired a guy to mow the lawn who mowed over the other half, even though they were still alive. But I have one thing that I planted left from that. I planted a bunch of stuff before my father's death, and then my father died, and right around this time we had this big drought, and I lost half of them, and then again. But I like plants. I like gardening is the point, and also like I'm interested in biogeography. Like that's a niche, but like kind of obsessive interest of mine. Let's see. I think it might be easier to talk about the stuff that I'm not interested in, which I can sort of like I've noticed when I've done trivia things, like I know almost nothing about most sports, like except like those things that like most people would know that wouldn't really count as trivia questions. I mean, I do know a few random facts, but typically because they tie into something else, right? But if it doesn't tie into something else, then I don't know stuff about sports. And pop culture, I am probably about average in terms of my knowledge. I'm worse than average with modern pop culture, but I'm a little better than average with historical pop culture. So it sort of evens out. And then aside from that, like, I don't really have a lot of interest in physics and chemistry, but a lot of the people, like writers I like, are physicists, which is making me think I should look into physics more because it might just be. I never got to take physics in high school for like reasons I won't get into, but that and that maybe that's just. But I just never. There didn't seem to be enough to get me interested in on its own. So yeah, like I guess those are sort of like the big. So modern pop culture, yeah, doesn't interest me that much. I mean, there are like exceptions, right, depending on what it is, but like in general, you can notice I still haven't done anything, and I'm not going to do anything on the Odyssey movie. I'm not going to watch it, like not out of because it's Christopher Nolan and any of this controversy. I just don't have an interest in watching the Odyssey movie. I haven't read what's is it Yesteryear? That's a lot of these channels are talking about, and I'm probably not going to because it sounds like an unpleasant book to read, and I generally don't read books that I don't think I'm going to enjoy unless I have a compelling reason to read them. But so yeah, pop culture stuff. I don't know a lot about sports and sports history and sports rules and stuff like that. I'm interested in tennis. I would like to play tennis, but it's an issue with tennis is it's kind of a rich person sport and you need access to a court. Combined with my motor skills are so bad that after doing a session of tennis lessons, I was still worse than the average beginner. And so I could not find people who would play tennis with me. But I think if I played it, I'd probably have more of an interest in like tennis history or really any racket sport. I like, well, except pickleball. I like the haptic feedback of like having a racket hitting a like ball, but like hitting a wiffle ball with a paddle is not that same haptic feedback, and I don't see the appeal of pickleball. Anyways, and then again, physics and chemistry don't really interest me. And engineering interests me, but I haven't really like I read a bunch of books on engineering when I was a kid, and I haven't really done that as an adult. I just haven't prioritized it. Like I'm interested in most things to some degree, and most things I can find some connection to stuff I'm interested in. Okay, I talked about this for a while. Let's see. So Primetime Bishop. Oh, so yeah. So Daniel, the last book he's recommending is Primetime Bishop author Alexander. Is it Nachai or Nachaz? I'm not sure. Dissertation from it's about Fulton Sheen and religious celebrity in America. Okay, that seems kind of interesting. Consciousness was a mistake. Consciousness was a mistake. Okay. Yeah, that's actually, I don't know if anyone here has read Blind Sight by Peter Watts. That was a book we did at the science fiction fantasy book club I attend. And that was basically the contention of this book, that consciousness was an evolutionary mistake. That is, it's a dead end while being highly like resource intensive. I feel like systems have to be adaptable, but I'm not sure what that means. I mean, read Anti-Fragile, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. I keep pushing that book, but this, for specifically this question of how are systems adaptable, that is a good place to start. And then from there, you could also consider reading Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows and Gaia by James Lovelock. So Ebb and Flow, those were 3 TBR books. Many of your books are interesting for me, and I'm watching them along my used book shopping route at libraries and thrift stores in my area. Yeah, so I assume you still live in Massachusetts, right? So there's a lot used bookstores and thrift stores in that area. Thoughts on reading the Bible? So I'll be honest, I know it's both like the most published book in history and also the like sort of foundation of much of Western culture, but I don't get a lot out of reading the Bible directly, at least when I've tried to. I don't know if it's like they're like the parables, right? Those are useful, but I'm already familiar with them, and like a lot of the early stories as well, which are sort of parables that are not framed as parables. But like just jumping into a random point in the Bible and reading, I tried to read the Bible cover to cover when I was a kid, and I thought I was supposed to understand and remember all of the begats. And so I got overwhelmed in Genesis and gave up. And then I told that story to my parents a couple years later, and they both, well, my father thought it was hilarious, at least. He was like, "Oh, you read the Bible and you thought you would understand the begats. Nobody pays attention to the begats." And then I've tried like just jumping in at random points, like especially like the Psalms, which people praise. And at least for me, like so far, I don't know what the right angle into appreciating it is, but right now I don't really know how to appreciate it. Let's see. thoughts on it's not the new stuff. It's bad. It just left me confused about why he. Okay, so Anne McGilchrist, why he'd expand these ideas in the directions to make him seem like he's veering towards apologetics and away from pantheism. Wait, is this Anne McGilchrist? Or let me just check. Is this person who's talking about Anne McGilchrist? Okay, yeah, it was. Oh, wait. Was this a different Ian? Was this referencing? Let me scroll back up. No, it was not. Okay. Let's see. And yeah, this person is referring to my job interview where, yeah, small flubs in conversation killed the job opportunity. Yeah, accommodation employers don't like granting has been the issue I constantly run into. Want to work with people, get malicious if you don't do what's expected with zero help. Yeah, that's something I noticed is I've been debating, because I want to talk about how I break both the Big Five personality test and the IQ tests. And the thing is, I know that, first of all, anything talking about IQ tests is going to perform a lot better than talking about the Big Five personality tests. And second of all, the ways that I break the IQ test are very well documented in the psychometric literature, whereas the ways that I break the Big Five are a lot less well documented. And they are issues of the ways that I break the IQ test are issues that they undermine the reliability of the test. So there's reliability versus validity. So reliability is how consistent a psychometric inventory, a psychometric assess tool is in the context of its own framework. And then validity is whether it's actually measuring what it purports to measure and how well it does that. And so with the Big Five, I would say that the issue is that I break the reliability of the test, but I don't break the validity necessarily. So I break the validity of the test, but I don't break the reliability. So the issue is that it doesn't reflect what it purports to reflect for me, but I still tend to get pretty consistent scores. Whereas with IQ tests, I break the very the very reliability of the test, its internal coherence in 3 different ways. So I've been debating, do I talk about the Big Five quickly as an introduction to the IQ test video, or do I do it as a separate video that I know is going to do a lot less well? And I think probably it's better to do a separate video. But anyways, the reason I'm mentioning that is because, so conscientiousness, and I'll sort of teaser for when I make that video, is I always scored low conscientiousness, which is because the way these questions are asked, they're heavy on execution. And what I've realized is a lot of execution is that neurotypical people will ask you to do something where a lot of how it's done according to their standards is assumed. And I don't know that. And so I would see people be way better at doing that. And I would struggle, combined with just executive dysfunction, like keeping my house clean, right? Those are sort of the 2 big issues where I struggle with conscientiousness, are that I cannot mind read neurotypicals to do what they want. And I realized I need to actually be asking people, hey, I need clarification on this. And then again, just basic housekeeping tasks, especially without ADHD medication. And so I tended to rate my own conscientiousness as extremely low. The thing is, I am actually internally, I very much try to be a conscientious person to often a pathological level. And I've had to sort of learn to be less conscientious. But that is, sorry, this is my long way of saying, so yeah, so employers often want you to basically mind read a neurotypical would do it this way. And so my thing is I can do things that no one else would have thought of. And at my last job, it was they'd have this random weird thing that no one else had ever encountered before, and they would give it to me because I could figure it out, right? But you ask me to do something that any computer science graduate could do, and I would take a month to do it. The computer science graduate could probably do it in a day or 2. Let's see. So I wanted to thank you for the channel. Thank you. Oh, hello from Izmir. Hi. Yeah, that is my favorite city in Turkey. At least it's the one that I would most, if I was living in Turkey, I'd most like to live in. I also really liked Sivas, which is, if I was going to live in Turkey, I feel of the places I've been, it would have to be either Izmir or Sivas would be the 2 places I would consider living. Do I know any books about linguistics? And if so, what could be some books you can recommend to someone who wants to learn as a beginner? If you want to, I would still say I tell people, and I don't know if there's a better one out there, but I still recommend The Language Instinct as a good introduction to linguistic language instinct by Steven Pinker. And that is like it's from the 90s, but I still think, and it's mostly, he's trying to sort of overturn elements of Chomskyanism, but it is also, he's introducing linguistics in a way that I think is very well explained and very clear. But I wouldn't necessarily say, that's like if you want a general overview of linguistics. My favorite book on linguistics still that I have read, of course, most of what I read, like informally in linguistics, was papers. So my favorite book on linguistics that I've read is Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things by George Lakoff. And so I want to reread, especially the first part, because he goes over stuff that I learned in undergrad and largely forgot and reminded me. Now I've forgotten some of it again, so I want to refresh my mind on that. And so that's the first part. And the second part is he's talking about stuff he learned from the Diyarbal language of Australia. And then the third part, which is the main part of the book, so he has three sections, and the first two are sort of about how language reflects like physical sensation of things like anger. And I forget there's another one, and then the last one it's about, like, the longest section is very specifically about like pronoun usage. Allison, you don't have any. Hi, Allison. You don't have any tennis courts at public parks near you? I actually do. Here in the Houston area, but like the town has a public tennis court that you can rent. However, when I'm from rural New England, and so when I was trying to learn tennis and wanted to get people to play, there were no public tennis courts in rural New England. Franklin County has like the highest per capita density of private schools in the country. So all the private schools have tennis courts that you can use, but access to them was sort of limited. Disc golf has been the only sport I can find fun as an adult. When I was at Hampshire College, like, I assume it's similar. I don't know how similar actually it is, but like the big sport that everyone at Hampshire College played was ultimate frisbee. Have I read any Marx Adam Smith? I started to read economic and philosophical manuscripts, and I also read I read the Communist Manifesto a while ago, but I read like on the Jewish question, because that's notorious. And the part one, I was like, wait, I don't get why this is notorious. And then part two, I'm like, okay, I see why this has become notorious. And then so that was short. And then I started reading economic and philosophical manuscripts, and then I kind of put that on pause. I have been, oh yes, I've read Jack Vance. Or is that the question? Jack Vance is my favorite fiction writer. And then Adam Smith, I'm slowly working my way through Wealth of Nations, which I'd probably be going quicker, except that he does like each chapter is like a half hour to read. And so it becomes, and also I've been reading it. I actually found physical copies I like, but I was reading it on my e-reader initially, so I don't like reading on e-reader as much. And I like it when books have shorter chapters in between those. I've been sort of working my way through it slowly. Happy birthday, welcome, Naraj. Hello. Do you have an opinion on Austrian economics? Yeah, I do. So when I first encountered Austrian economics sort of as a neoliberal, basically, which is funny because people like blaming specifically Hayek for neoliberalism, but neoliberalism isn't really, modern neoliberalism isn't really quite what Hayek wanted. Like, I sort of thought that Austrian economists were too extreme in their statements. And then as I've sort of understood it better, my conclusion is Austrian economics is probably the most like accurate representation of this narrow focus of the question it's trying to answer, which are basically how do we maximize economic prosperity. But it's also like a hyper-focused mindset, and something I talked about when I read F.A. Hayek's The Fatal Conceit is and this is I think his last book, so it was sort of his swan song, is he was sort of arguing against modern conceptions of egalitarianism as being that basically the idea that substantial equality of opportunity is possible. Because a lot of people say, well, I don't believe in equality of outcomes, but I believe in equality of opportunity. And he was sort of, this argument was basically you can't even really have meaningful equality of opportunity. But like stuff he mentioned in passing, I realized like Hayek was aware of, but seemed to downplay the importance of outside factors. And so one thing I've been thinking about, for example, is, I'm going to write a blog post on this, is rent control. Like rent control is probably one of the most clear-cut the question of whether rent control raises or lowers rent prices long-term is probably one of the most like incontrovertible, unquestionable conclusions we have in any social science. Rent control, but you would expect it logically to raise prices long-term, rents long-term, and it consistently, when every empirical study pretty much, except for like a tiny handful that are awash, it raises rent prices long-term. But the thing about it is, so and despite that, like I think like 85% of Americans support rent control. And so you have to ask, okay, well, is this just what Brian Kaplan would call rational ignorance, where you are trying to, it just doesn't make sense for you to be informed on the policy? And I think in some cases it is, because, it asks the people and they'll say, yeah, rent control will make prices cheaper, and it doesn't. But it also, I think there's more to it. And I think one thing is most people tend to have very high time preferences. They prioritize the short term. And in the short term, rent control means that your rent is not going to go up this year. And so that reflects just a lot of people having preferences for, that's all I care about is tell me my rent won't go up next year, combined with when you have areas that'll make it easy to build housing prices might be cheaper, but it also means the city is getting bigger and it changes, and people don't like people coming to where they live and changing it, right? And so like Texas, because it's very easy to build housing here, all the cities are booming. And so I think that's basically like the element that economists are missing, right? Is, yeah, some people Austrian economists are missing is some, like with rent control, yeah, a lot of it, with people saying rent control will lower rent prices, a lot of it might be rational ignorance. But a lot of it, I think, it reflects either people just having a very short-term preference for, okay, all that I care about is that my rent is going down or not, it's going up less like immediately next year. Or like recognition that if you make it easier to build housing, more people will move to the city and they'll change the things you don't like. Sorry, that's my long answer to Austrian economists. Is I think they are the most accurate like economists in terms of the basic questions of how do we like increase wealth, but they're also not considering. And the funny, because the focus of Austrian economists is on human action. They're not really considering whether there is any validity to the motivations that people have for not wanting to like increase wealth, overall wealth, as being the top thing they prioritize. Happy birthday to my father. Thank you. A couple people said that. And then let's see. So how many books do I read a year? So I don't keep track beyond like weekly, maybe sometimes bi-weekly. So most weeks I read 2 to 5 books. And so I've estimated, because it's going to be like, it's not going to be, so you would say, okay, well, the average of 2 to 5 would be 3.5, right? But I'm like, but it's going to be, most weeks I'm going to be towards the lower end of that. So I probably, like, there are weeks where I will read no books, or I will read like 1 book a week, right? And then there are weeks where I will read a bunch of books, so they tend to be shorter books, right? But those can also have like if I'm reading like 11 short books in a week, right, that can have a disproportionate impact on the outcome. So I'm like, you might expect, okay, well, if I was every week I was reading 2 to 5 books, it would probably be like 2.5 books a week, and that would be, so 52 times 2.5 would be basically about 120, right? Maybe 130. But then there are those weeks where I'm reading a bunch of shorter books, so it might be more like 150 probably, but I don't really know, because again, I don't keep track beyond the weekly basis. Let's see. Any good book on economics? Depends. It really depends what you're looking to get out of it, because there are a bunch of different schools of economics covering different questions from different angles. I will say, I really found donut economics super interesting, but it's also in a context where it has me questioning a lot of assumptions people are assuming. And I don't know if you don't have that background by like how useful it would be. I remember when I was in undergrad, and I'm going to make a video on this at some point, because I've realized like the stupidest educated people who know the least about their own field I have met have consistently been economists. I'm not saying all economists are stupid. Like, I've met a lot of very smart economists, just that when I meet someone who knows nothing about their own field, they're more likely to be in economics for whatever reason. And so I remember when I was in undergrad, there was someone who, my school, you design your major, and he was studying alternative economics. And I showed him the original Hayek versus Keynes rap battle. And he's like, oh yeah, I think I've heard of Keynes. And he was like in his 3rd or 4th year. And I'm like, you're studying alternative economics and you think you've heard of the most important economist of the 21st century, so of the 20th century, and the second most important economist of the 20th century doesn't even ring a bell to you. Like, how are you? What are you studying? Like, how are you studying alternative economics if you don't know what who the mainstream economists are and where their ideas even come from? Let's see. So, I don't know if the humanities are dying. I mean, all fields are sort of have issues facing them. I have to know more what you think about that. Opinion on John McWhorter. So I know he is, and I described him in a video, and then immediately I realized I keep forgetting that Noam Chomsky is alive because he's like 100. But I described John McWhorter as the second most famous living linguist after Steven Pinker, forgetting Chomsky was also alive. But anyways, I read some of his papers in undergrad, I'm pretty sure, and then I read his book, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, which is in my video on, like, I think the title, AB title, that one is like, why do we keep ignoring the obvious? But it's basically, he talks about in that book the evidence that Welsh had a big impact on English grammar, and like we accept that same degree of evidence without loanwords for Finnish influence or Finnic influence on Russian and Dravidian influence on some of the Central Indian languages, but we don't accept it for English. So I thought that was a really interesting book. I haven't read any of his other things. He has a couple of books on Creoles that I got because I'm really interested in the topic of Creolization, but I haven't read them yet. His political book, or at least I don't know if he's wrote more than one, but the one that I got, I did that thing where I read the introduction in the first chapter, and I'm like, this doesn't sound like it's going to be terribly interesting or insightful. I've read a couple of his articles in the Atlantic on political topics, which seemed fine, but not terribly like adding anything new. Do I think being a polymath is advantageous? I think it's advantageous if you built your reputation on something like physics, because so obviously, like, people make fun of like physicists like jumping and meddling in other fields when they're bad at it, but there are physicists who go into other fields when they're good at it, like Michael Polanyi, for example, or um, David Bohm. And people tend to sort of have this hierarchy of like how serious your field of study is, and they tend to rank like physics that like the pinnacle, and then like engineering and chemistry and math sort of at the next level, and then medicine and biology sort of next, and then everything else sort of at the bottom. I think if you start in another field, well, I guess depending on what's that advantageous for, building a reputation as a serious thinker, I think it's going to be a lot easier if you have specifically a physics background, or failing that, another STEM background, or failing that, like a medical or biology background. But in terms of like understanding the world, I do think like learning a lot about a lot of things is helpful if you can do it. Let's see, IQ test. Using your time to make a video that will perform well on YouTube. Yeah, but I still want. Sorry, I still want to do the big five, and because it's less dramatic, I think I might do it. I don't think I could quite fit my explanation of the big five into a short. I think it would be like the shortest I could get it would be like 5 or 6 minutes. And probably how old am I? I just turned 38, like less than a month ago. Actually, no, not less than a month ago. A month ago. It's August 15th now. And my birthday is July 15th. Yeah, I read the first 2 books of the Book of the Long Sun, but then I never got around to reading the third one, so I didn't have the same like immediate love of Gene Wolfe as Jack Vance. And I will say, like, the only Jack Vance works that I have read that I thought were straight up bad were actually, no, some of his mysteries are underwhelming, but none of the ones that I've read are straight up bad. Gene Wolfe, the book club picked The Demolished Man, which was one of his later books, and man, was that a bad, or no, The Borrowed Man. Demolished Man is Alfred Bester. Man, was that a bad book. But I know you're talking about like the Long Sun books, and I've only read 2 of those. My father recommended them to me after I liked Jack Vance, and it didn't have the same like impact on me. I think if I was going to call anyone like more famous writer the successor to Jack Vance, it would probably be Dan Simmons, which obviously Hyperion Cantos is science fiction, but I feel like, and he was a Jack Vance fan. I feel like that is more. I mean, more in sort of the, not the spirit of Vance, but more the feel of Vance than Gene Wolfe. Let's see. Thank you. Yeah, happy belated birthday. But yep, I showed my father. Okay, yeah. Example of rent control. Drawing books that I recommend. Not specifically. I do think maybe Ruskin's Elements of Drawing would be a good place to start, just because it's a classic. Gavin, good thing to say is Whole World. Can it be said when we're talking about rent control, we've already reached a certain point with the facts that we're discussing it? And Signal, I mean, something's going to go up anyways. Let's see. What do I think of Evola and anti-modernism? I still have not. I've done with 3 of Evola's books. I have done that thing where I read the introduction and first chapter. So it's 2 most famous, right? Christ of the Modern World and Ride the Tiger, and then also Fascism Viewed from the Right. And so he seems like someone who is interesting and worth reading at some point, but not a priority. It's also the only person who I take seriously, who takes Julius Evola seriously, is Nima Parvini. And even then, I'm not sure how seriously he takes them. He talked about him in his book, which one was it? The Prophets of Doom, as someone sort of, but it was like, that was a syntopical like analysis of several writers. So I haven't seen him talk about, although I don't really, Nima Parvini is probably like my second or third most consistently overlapped channel, but his newer videos are basically like sort of, he became associated with the far right, and then he got annoyed that the far right wasn't doing what he wanted. So now he's identifying as a sensible centrist, and basically all of his newer videos seem to be ranting about British politics from this perspective of his, which I'm interested in. A lot of his older videos are good. But anyways, so I don't know what he thinks about Evola and how seriously he takes it, but everyone else who I take seriously does not take Evola seriously. But the fact that like a lot of people who, like the fact that he influences so many people still means he is kind of worth reading, even if he's sort of in a similar position to Ayn Rand, I think, although less well known and consequently less controversial. Of like, he tends to be a lot more popular with like mass people than with like people who are serious about a topic. But again, I want to read him, but I haven't. Again, I've read the introduction and first chapter of 3 of his books that just sort of get a sense of what his argument is going to be and where they situate in all that. And I mean, Ride the Tiger is actually kind of relevant to what I want to do, but there's a lot of other books like that that are more relevant. Like I want to read Christopher Lashett's book, The Minimal Self, before I consider reading like Ride the Tiger. Let's see. Philosophy guy, that is also accurate. I've heard of that Friedman guy. Having heard of Milton Friedman is still better than like, or is that reference to like something someone actually said? One good thing about Marx is that he wasn't Keynesian. Is that Milton Friedman? That's a good quote, whoever said that. It's also interesting that Marx said something to the end of his life, said something to the effect of, by how the standards of how people understand Marxism, I am not a Marxist. And let's see, what's the best book that provides a comprehensive timeline of economic history, also covering the major economic philosophies and schools of thought? I don't know of a book that I have read like that. I do have a book that I bought that I want to read at some point that is called something like Hayek and Keynes, like History of a Rivalry or something. And that would be just focused on like the 20th century, because economics really as a field of study started with Adam Smith. And then you had Ricardo built on Smith, and then Marx sort of responded to Ricardo. Herbert Spencer was the neo-Nazi guy. Sorry, don't want to confuse the two of them. But anyway, I'm thinking of it because I started reading Hilaire Belloc's The Great Heresies, and they have a review by a guy called Robert Spencer, who is. And I was like, wait, why would you want to have a review by Richard Spencer on this book? And I'm like, oh, it's not Richard Spencer, it's Robert Spencer. And so I have that. Anyway, Herbert Spencer was like, he's often accused of being the founder of social Darwinism, and he was like big guy in sociology. And let's see. But anyway, but I don't think he really directly did economics much. So you had Smith, you had Ricardo, then you had Marx, and at the same time you also had Menger, who was the founder of the Austrian school and developed the idea of comparative advantage. And then in the 20th century, 20th century was dominated by Keynes and Hayek, and basically sort of the establishment took stuff they liked from Keynes, stuff they liked from Hayek, like selectively, and that basically became modern neoliberalism. And so, depending on what you want to understand, if you want to understand the whole history, again, I don't have a clue where to begin, like what would be a good book on that. If you want to sort of understand how our modern economic thinking developed, this book that I haven't read, and I don't remember the title of, but like Hayek and Keynes, I will probably need to get up briefly in like half an hour or so, and I will see if I can find that book quickly when I do. But that might be a good place to start. But again, I haven't read it, so I can't vouch for it. Let's see. Life experience knowledge versus book knowledge. So there's an interesting observation from Confucius. I don't remember exactly which chapter it was, but I'm not going to quote it exactly right. But basically, he says, like, you look at the peasants and they have like vitality and energy, but they have no refinement. And you look at the educated people and they have refinement, but they have like no vitality. And I think that's sort of a similar thing when it comes to like book learning versus life experience. Like people who like talk about, I learned everything I learned through the school of life. I learned it all through the school of hard knocks. They have typically learned to operate in a very specific context. And what they've learned works well in that context, but it doesn't necessarily work as well in any other context, and it limits their opportunities. Books will can expand your horizon, expand what you can learn, and like give you topics of conversation. They can provide social capital. But where was I going with this? Right. Yeah, so book learning can provide sort of ideas and frameworks, but you can't really determine what's useful and how to test it until you have real world experience. And I think it's fascinating because we have like these LLMs, right? And they provide answers that when they're right, it's because they're basically based on the body of what people have said about it, but they have no inherent understanding. And so they can be disastrously wrong in like ways no human would, because they have no embodied experience. They're also obviously not conscious, but also compare them to slime molds, but even slime molds have embodied experiences. And like one obvious thing they will mess up is they will mess up timelines because they don't really have an inherent experience of time. And so like it's a case of, I think if you want to get to sort of the best place in life, you need to be out in the real world, like doing stuff, testing ideas, but it is helpful to be reading books and developing frameworks. And within where you are, and that depends on, like, I tend to read a lot of books and then do stuff in the real world more selectively. Someone who is way more extroverted might do a lot of stuff in the real world, but still read a few books. Let's see. Make a deliberate effort between balance, production, and consumption. I do not. I have spent most of my life doing some form of writing. Right now, I'm trying to tamp down the creative writing while I'm working on a project that I think could sell very well, but it's heavily executed. It's a kind of book that I'm one of a handful of people who I could probably write this book, but it's also heavily execution focused. And so I need to sort of force myself to do that. Can it be said that knowledge equals humanities plus science, or humanities plus science equals communion and sciences agency? No, I would not agree with that. So like one thing I've realized is it is a popular, and I realized this because of Patrick Deneen, one of his books he was talking about, apparently like it's super popular for people at elite schools. So I think I mentioned in one of my videos, what was the evolutionary psychology video, I mentioned that I went to school with Eric Hoel, who is now like a famous neuroscience with a Wikipedia page and like a Substack blog with like 30,000 followers. And I remember like he was not quite like the midwit stereotype. Like he was smarter than a midwit, but he had some of those same tendencies. And that was my impression. And I felt like I couldn't communicate stuff. And so we had a lot of arguments where he thought I was not getting sort of the establishment sort of narrative, and I couldn't get why he couldn't see beyond the establishment narrative. And his whole blog is like, we need to synthesize sciences and humanities. And I'm like, oh, it shows that he's moved on. And then I learned, like, from Patrick Deneen, that's like all these people at these elite schools is what they do is I'm going to study something in the humanities because that's my passion. And then I'm going to like study something that like, is going to make me money, right? And then they try to synthesize sciences and humanities, and they see them as these two separate opposite things. And so for them, yeah, you're studying the sciences to make money and you're studying the humanities because your passion. So that represents agency and communion. But it's the like if you look at people like people who are passionate about the sciences, like it is very much a communion thing for them. You read like physicists like waxing like lyrical on physics or mathematicians waxing lyrical on math, right? And honestly, math is like people who study math, especially at the postgraduate level, are much more like artists than they are like scientists. But anyways, and they both also like in terms of agency, like the humanities can absolutely give you, I mean, obviously like studying the humanities is like it is also a tool to advance your status and advance, but studying the humanities can also sort of help you figure out the world. So yeah, I don't think it's an agency communion thing inherent to it at all. What I do think, where I think you're right, is that a lot of people in elite schools, they do this thing that's sort of widely accepted of I'm going to study the sciences because it pays, and I'm going to study the humanities because I like it. And they talk about how we need to synthesize them because for them, there are two separate things that they're separating. And then they need to figure out how to get them back together. And in that context, the sciences they represent like agency motivations and the humanities represent community motivations. But for me, like it's just a whole spectrum that's interconnected. And I don't see that same kind of dichotomy that they do. Recommend Evola on history. Philosophy is decent, but give or take. Oh, who was being cheeky? Sorry. Evelyn. Oh, sorry, Elvira, sorry. Oh, heard of that Friedman guy. Okay. Anthropology book. Philosophy guy. Let's see. I think book has more knowledge than life experience because life experience can't cover quantum mechanics, etc. Yeah. So there are some things that you can only learn from books. That's true, but there are some things that you. Aloha. Hi. I forget your. I recognize you. I don't remember. I know your real name or not, but hi. And anyway, so best anthropology books. So I've been thinking about this actually because I'm like, I would kind of like to make a book on my favorite like anthropology books, but I'm realizing there is only one anthropology book I can think of that I like that is clearly just a work of anthropology, and that is The Original Affluent Society by James Sussman. Everything else I'm thinking of as like an anthropology book. It's really like work of field linguistics, like Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, or work of political science, like James C. Scott, The Art of Not Being Governed, or a work of psychology, like The Weirdest People in the World, or it's like the dawn of everything. It's collaboration between an anthropologist and an archaeologist. And so, like straight up anthropology book, really the only one I can recommend would be Sussman, Original Affluent Society. There's a lot of like anthropology adjacent books that I like that I reference. Yeah, that's a good point, Allison. I think that if people think they pay more attention in real life than they actually do, if you're going to pick up on meaningful things around you, you have to be paying attention. That's interesting in sort of two angles. One of them is, my mother and I hosted Spanish exchange students for 3 summers in a row. This was after I got kicked back from Turkey before I went to grad school. I was just a little over 2 years, but happened to like overlap with 3 summers. And so when we were doing that, the second student we hosted, I noticed like he noticed everything. Like he observed and remembered every detail of what happened around him. And I was super impressed. And he was sort of annoyed. And he's like, yeah, people always comment on it, but it's sort of normal to me. And I'm realizing that's sort of like me with like remembering stuff that I've read, right? Is like I remember it and it's like, yeah, I don't know. I just remember it. I've obviously thought about it more and how that happens. But anyways, and there is also like Idris Shah talks about like, and I have a short out on like attention is, and also a long form video that's older on attention is the fundamental human social currency. And he has this 4-page chapter on learning how to learn, which again, I think if I was going to recommend 4 pages of nonfiction to most people, like this would be like the single 4 pages I would most recommend is that 4-page chapter in Learning How to Learn about attention, where basically the point he makes, like just boiling it down, but I think it really helps to read it, is that people think they don't pay attention to how they give attention, and they give attention to the wrong places, which is even more relevant today than when it was written like last century. And we seek attention without. Bye, philosophy guy. Thank you for your questions. And so we seek attention without thinking about if we're seeking the right kind of attention. And so in terms of paying attention, also, like one thing about sort of neurodivergent, I think, is that it can be sort of sensory overload, like notice is because we're noticing more things, and then it becomes hard to notice anything. And so when I'm like doing well and engaged, I will notice a lot of what's going on around me, like if I'm just sort of engaging with the world. But if I am either hyperfixated on something else, or if I am like distracted by everything going on around me, I will notice basically nothing. So I tried to invent the field of computational pragmatics, but failed to do so. So why did you fail? And what do you think formalizing attempts like formal syntax and semantics? So basically, pragmatics is the fascinating thing is with the tools that we have now. So after I got kicked out of grad school, I went to there was a, forget what you, like a conference focused on, was it natural language processing, I think? And there was a guy who worked at Amazon, talked about Amazon chatbots were trying to do and the problems he was trying to solve. And I'm like, these are pragmatic problems. And I like knowing this application they're trying to solve, I bet I could make progress. But then I looked into it, I'm like, I would not want to work at Amazon. It does not look like obviously, like on the floor, it's not a good climate, but it's also not a good climate for their white collar people either. Like they make you work super long hours and they're like, okay, but we'll let you bring your dog in. I'm like, well, I'm not really a dog person. I don't have dogs. And even if I could bring my birds in like to Amazon, well, first of all, the screaming would annoy other people, but second of all, I don't think the birds would enjoy being in an Amazon building. Um, but anyways, sorry, that was getting off into the weeds of the uh, right. So basically, like there's not really a lot of like work, at least when I was looking on computational pragmatics. Like the big thing that people seem to be trying to do is irony detection. And so my advisor suggested, okay, here's this paper on irony detection. For your second year paper, why don't you replicate what they did and then do a little extra? And I spent the whole year trying to figure out how to do that, but I didn't really know what I didn't know about how to do it. And so I couldn't figure out how to do it. And I only really figured that out, I think, when I got my next job. And I'm like, oh, like there's things that I don't know. And I need to actually ask questions to figure out what I don't know in order to clarify what I don't know. Idris Shah, and I'll put it in chat. Yeah, I suppose that's probably a popular title for books. I bet if I put it in, it would turn up Shaw's book just because, to the extent Amazon information are personalized, I have a bunch of his stuff. Although most of his books I've got from A Books through, because I like the Octagon Press hardcovers. And he is the author of Reflections, which I was reading from a little bit at the beginning as well, and I did that last live stream, and I've talked about this book a few times. I'm going to take a brief break. I will be back in about 3 minutes, and I will also try to see if I can find the Keynes Hayek book while I'm up. And yeah, he does, and you can read everything he's done on that website for free. Although, if you want to like get an ebook you can download, you have to pay for it. I will be right back in about 3 minutes. unmute myself, right? Sorry. Okay, I'm back. So I grabbed the book. This book I've been meaning to read it at some point. I don't know when, if I will. I use the term maybe-R for books that I think I might read. This one's somewhere between TBR and maybe-R. I think I'm likely to read it, but I'm not completely certain. Oh, actually, let me also put the light back too. There we go. Okay. There we go. Okay. And so I haven't read it, but it is. So Keynes and Hayek, they both respected each other, but they also had like opposed ideas. Keynes' idea was basically the idea that you should sort of have counter-cyclic financial policy. So you should tax heavily in boom periods, and you should spend heavily in bust periods. And of course, governments have generally liked the second half of that a lot and not the first half. And so they've adopted the second half of that into their policies. And then Hayek basically argued government should be hands-off as much as possible, which has been the basis for a lot of deregulation, which was as I've observed, deregulation is rarely deregulation. It's usually like regulating the regulations or counter-regulation, and privatization of stuff that really might make more sense as public or co-op, especially if it already is, like utilities. And so that sort of neoliberal is basically the Washington consensus, which is defined by a number of factors. So it's belief that you should have generally a pretty free markets with limited government regulation, as well as a strong welfare state. And there's a bunch of other sort of assumptions that they make too. But it sort of came out of this combination of cherry picking what politicians liked from Keynes, cherry picking what they liked from Hayek, distorting both to fit what they wanted to do, and then a few other just things that they sort of justified in various ways. And I also grabbed while I was up, it's another book about history of ideas, which I am almost certainly going to read this one at some point. This one's definitely on my TBR. I forget which book I was reading that was talking about it, but it sounds extremely interesting. It's talking about the conflict between Erasmus and Martin Luther. And so Erasmus was like an early Catholic sort of humanist guy who, with the Reformation, like he shared a lot of the criticisms of Luther, but not to the point of it like leaving the Catholic Church over it. And he sort of lost influence and also sort of lost his self-confidence after the Reformation. But like, I'm curious about the details, and it's a thick book, so there's clearly a lot in here. And it is also again, I forget where I was reading it, but it was a writer that I was like, I really find this person credible. And so I'm gonna, so question, so what year is it published? Are you asking about Keynes versus Hayek, or Learning How to Learn? Keynes versus Hayek was published 2011. When I also grabbed, just quickly mention, Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi, which I have a meaning I want to read at some point. I was thinking of him as he's one of these sort of important figures in economic history, but it turns out it sounds like he might be the antidote to the issues I have with the Austrian school, and that it sounds like he might have addressed a lot of these sort of questions for extra economic incentives, basically. And so now I'm very curious to read this one. But okay, let's see. So next question. So thoughts on the AI companies that are buying pre-2022 rare books and training their models and destroying them after. So I have a video on that, actually. It's my second most recent video. And basically, from what I can see, it sounds like these are mostly books that we wouldn't care about anyways. And on top of that, like, the fact is, like, we're losing books like this all the time just because people don't really care. So it's not good, but it's not the worst thing ever. And I'm more bothered by stuff like, for example, because ultimately, like, this is about driving economic development, right? And to drive economic development, China built the Three Gorges Dam, which destroyed the Yangtze River system and drove two like fascinating species, at least the Baiju river dolphin and the Chinese paddlefish, to extinction. For economic development, Turkey will also sort of political incentive to destroy Kurdish nationalism. Turkey flooded Hasankeyf, one of the most important historical sites in Turkey. For economic development, I think it was the Brazilians, might have been a Brazilian-Argentine collaboration. They dammed up Gira Falls, argued by some people to be the most beautiful waterfalls in the world, and then dynamited the waterfalls so they could never come back, even if the dam went away. And those things, like, because it's hard to argue with the immediate like benefits of economic development of energy, like tell people like, hey, don't get your energy now so that we can have, future generations can have these important, these rare animals, these important historic sites, these beautiful waterfalls. but it also, I feel like we lost a lot more than that we're probably losing with these books, basically. Well, Allison, I'm shocked that your econ friend didn't know Keynes. He is taught in Gen Ed. So typically, he wasn't a friend. I did not really get along with this person, and I was suggesting this video to him as sort of a peace offering, because he was someone I needed to interact with, and we did not get along. And so I was like, we weren't like outright enemies. We sort of, and so I was like, hey, you're studying as one of econ, you might like this video. And he's like, oh yeah, I think I've heard of Keynes. But yeah, thing is, Hampshire College, it lets you build your own major. And so if you have a good advisor and you are yourself sort of motivated, that is a fantastic opportunity. But if you are clueless and you have a bad advisor, it's a great opportunity to learn nothing. So I don't know what he was studying for 3 years or however long it was, but like it wasn't clearly. New Hampshire doesn't have Gen Ed requirements. We had distribution requirements. So you have to take one course in each of the 5 schools. So natural science, cognitive science, social science, and then 2 humanities schools. There was like a feud between faculty. So we had 2 different humanities schools that basically just the split was which sort of culture of the school they wanted better. And let's see. So Washington. Yeah, he did not mention names. Like I didn't, to be honest, I don't know if I asked him, who are you reading? But I never heard him. Like he was just, oh, I'm studying alternative economics. And then I had never actually heard him discuss it. Like he would say he was discussing it, and then I never heard him actually discuss it. Like most people who were studying stuff, now that I think about it, would talk about what they were studying a little bit. He just said he was studying and then moved on to other things. But that is like actually the least shocking experience I've had with someone who was studying economics, because he was an undergrad at a school where you had that sort of freedom to fail in this way if you picked the wrong advisor. Whereas the other 2 people, and I'm going to make a video on this, but I'll share these stories with you now because they're both short, are both people who were in economics master's programs, and so who really had no excuse for not knowing what they didn't know. So one of them he was a UMass student, and we were arguing about economics because this guy, he wanted like 100% tariffs. Like he wanted the US to be completely autarkic. Like everything in the US we consume should be made in the US. And I was talking about comparative advantage, and he was like, and he was like, that's not a thing. I'm an economics master's student. If that was a thing, I would have heard of it, which comparative advantage, like, again, goes back to Karl Menger. It's foundational to economics. And he was in this master's program, and he hadn't heard of it. And then there was another person who, the opposite extreme, he was a hardcore fan of the Austrian economists, but didn't understand their ideas and would repeat them in very garbled form. And so I was talking about natural monopolies, and it's like, well, natural monopolies don't exist. And then we had this long, incoherent conversation. And the Austrian economists do have an argument for why natural monopolies don't exist, which I think, from what I understand, is basically being pedantic about definitions and refusing to acknowledge what people mean. Like, it's sort of refusing to cooperate with the people they disagree with. But anyways, and then I was like, wait a second, what do you think natural monopolies are? What's an example of a natural monopoly? Is like, well, you're saying monopolies are natural, right? It's something like Amazon. I'm like, no, Amazon is not a natural monopoly. Like, and he was clearly just, thinking ours monopolies are natural. So, and these were, again, economics master students. So that is more, the fact that one of them didn't know what comparative advantage is, and one of them didn't know what a natural monopoly is, that is more incredible to me than this clueless undergrad not knowing who Hayek was and not knowing what Keynes is famous for. Let's see, Washington consensus, best characterization of neoliberalism I've heard. Well, it's a technical term that's like used by academics. Why read the Keynes Hayek book when you read actual economic studies? I think it is useful to read the secondary literature on stuff, because I made one video on, but I have a short coming out too, but I want to make more on the idea of these libraries of the mind, and from the P.R. Bayard's book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. And like a lot of what I do is I'm trying to situate books in terms of what he calls the collective library, understand their relationship to each other. And secondary literature can be really good for that. Do you think being autistic had an unconscious influence on your interest in computational linguistics? I can't understand people intuitively, so I can mean by formalizing. No, not at all. I was interested in pragmatics, and that was clear about being autistic, is because that is, like, I pragmatics is the part of language that I struggle with the most. And so I wanted to understand that. And it's actually interesting. I've been looking through like my old psychometric things. And I will tell you, so fun fact, so my first autism evaluation just after I turned 11, he couldn't give me an IQ score because the IQ test they used, so there's the comprehension subtest, which is basically pragmatics. It's do you understand these social situations? And I got it was either a 1 or a 0 on that, but it was first percentile. And then the do you know what these words are subtest, you know, the verbal like fluency or whatever it was called, like above the 99.9 percentile, right? So I was like 2 of these subtests. One of them, the pragmatics one, I was at the absolute bottom, and then knowing what words mean, I was at the absolute top with everything else sort of spread between. And obviously I am like, I understand pragmatics more now, but that's why I'm interested in it. And then computational linguistics is, if you want a job as a linguist, like most of the jobs are computational linguistics. And so I was like, I should use this as sort of a backdoor into like computer science and tech, basically, because I took computer science course in undergrad, but in order to learn how to code, but I didn't really take, like, I didn't have a computer science background. And so that was going to give me like more of a background about like learning a lot of technical stuff, basically, or like formal technical stuff. I was there, obviously, like I've been good technically. Like the generation I was the generation when like a lot of stuff was hackable. And so I did a lot of like not real hacking, but, you know, sort of like minor, like easy hacking, like URL hacking, for example, like with PHP sites. So, and then, so let's see, have I read Nick Land's The Dark Enlightenment, and what do I think about it? What made me want to live in Turkey? So, Turkey was sort of interesting. So I had, actually, I answered Dark Enlightenment first. Yes, I have. I didn't find it terribly interesting. What I'm finding with these neo-reactionaries, the ones I've been reading, is I'm sometimes finding other books from them that are interesting, but I'm mostly not finding their own theory interesting. Nick Land, I'm finding interesting, but a lot of it is the cybernetic stuff. I mean, it is interesting to like compare, and then why did I want to live in Turkey? So that's basically, when I was in middle school, I learned about the Kurds, and I was fascinated with and obsessed with the cause of the Kurds. And then what I learned, I started, you know, being online, I started meeting Turks, and I would be like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm annoyed about what your country's doing with the Kurds. And they'd be like, yeah, we're not really happy with how the government is treating the Kurds too. And what I've realized is this is actually pretty common. Like when you meet like educated English speaking people in other countries, they tend to be like the most liberal people in those countries, right? And they're concerned with like how their countries treat minority groups. But I was like, oh wow, this is amazing. Like Turks are really like aware of like what their country's doing wrong. And then I looked into Turkish culture and history. And I'm like, oh wow, this is fascinating. And the Turkish language is fascinating. And so I sort of developed a fascination with Turkey out of that. And then Turkey's a beautiful country. Like I love most aspects of Turkish culture. So Allison said, I used to teach comparative advantage to freshmen at Gen Ed. I guess schools that offer more freedom are good for everybody, but perhaps not for everyone. So to be clear, the student who didn't know comparative advantage was at UMass. So like it is the UMass Amherst. It's the flagship state school. It's considered, it's not like UT or UC level, but it's still considered, you know, one of the best public universities in the country. Where he was, I don't know where he went to undergrad, in fairness, but possible he went to undergrad in a place that didn't have a good curriculum, and then they just assumed in a master's program, you know it, right? And Allison says, I think I'm smart, and sometimes I read secondary literature and primary sources together because both can be beneficial, and there's no reason to have a purity test for learning ideas. Yeah, absolutely agree. And that was something one of my early videos that I planned on making that I never made is a defense of airport books, what people call airport books. And mostly I think about like nonfiction. I was watching someone's video recently where they were talking about airport books, and they meant like romantasy or type books, or like, and I'm like, I guess it probably sells at airports now too, but people will sell like a lot of these sort of pop books at airports, and a lot of them can be good, can be useful, both in terms of synthesis of old ideas, but also often presenting original ideas, even if it's not necessarily, or is that, they're good at presenting original ideas, even if they are not necessarily like following the standards of academic rigor that is expected. And I've realized a lot of that is, I mean, there's a number of factors, like as Kuhn and as Michael Polanyi have noted in different ways. And it's funny, because I also just mentioned Karl Polanyi, so there are two people who you might be talking about. Well, there's more than two, but there's sort of two famous ones. So Michael Polanyi is a physicist and philosopher of science. And then Karl Polanyi, he he's really known for this one book, but it is, I would say, from what I've heard, it seems like the most important book in economic history in the 20th century that was not written by Hayek or Keynes. Yeah, I agree. Having a purity test for reading means you're missing out on stuff, and that's something Idju Shah hammers home a lot in his books, and I think he's told this story in various ways, that people will be like, I want the best possible teachers. And Idju Shah, one of the things he observes is he's like, often the best teachers start by learning from like worse teachers, but like then figuring stuff out on their own. And if they can do that, maybe you can too, which I think is kind of true. But I think it's also the people who can become the best teachers are because they're the kind of people who can piece together things on their own. And I've noticed, I think, so you guys know about signaling versus and counter signaling, right? So signaling is sort of, it's in biology and social science. If it like, it's basically you are doing something that conveys something about you that you want to be recognized. And so it might be like in biology, it would be like, there's this thing that antelope do called stotting, where they like jump up and down. And it's thought that is to signal to predators that, hey, I'm so fit, I can waste energy doing this energy intensive jumping thing. And so don't bother chasing me. And they do, because they tend to do it when predators are seen. And then in humans, it might be you're doing it to signal like, I'm high status, right? And so there is like a saying that's something to the effect of like, poor people want to look like rich people, and poor people want to look like new money, and new money wants to look like old money. Like new money wants to differentiate themselves from the middle class, and so they spend conspicuously. And then old money wants to differentiate themselves from new money, so they live in a very unostentatious manner to sort of do what's called counter signaling. And I think that applies in terms of like intelligence too, as I've realized, like I am smart enough, like I have never in my life had encountered anyone who gave me the impression they thought I was dumb. Like I complained about how the public schools treated me for being in special education as an autistic student. But that was, I don't think they thought I was dumb. I think they just thought I was like an unpredictable element, and they didn't want me possibly ruining education for the real smart kids, as opposed to thinking I'm dumb. And I have been often very stupid, but that's because there are certain kinds of stupidity that you need to be really dumb to convince yourself could be true. Anyways, sorry. Can you explain how Turkey was recognizing problems? So I was specifically thinking about the Kurdish situation and how historically Turkey banned public use of the Kurdish language and would not let Kurds use like the Kurdish letters of the alphabet, because the Turkish alphabet doesn't use certain letters. And so W, Q, and a couple others, and they wouldn't let them use them. K also, I think. No, Turkish has K. What are they? I think there's 4 letters that Turkish doesn't use, and I forget W and Q are 2 of them. And so, and so the fact that I was talking to educated Turks, and they would be like, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I think the Turkish government, like how we're treating the Kurds has been appalling, and I think we need to do better. And I'm like, oh wow, this is amazing, because of course in the US, like we were still having issues around like people saying the Civil War wasn't about slavery, right? And I'm like, this seems like the Turks seem way more aware of their own history than Americans do. But I'm realizing, no, I was just the English-speaking Kurds I was meeting online, like in the early 2000s, right, were just more liberal by a lot, like than the average Turk. And I have stories about it's fascinating, but I'm not entirely sure I can tell some of these stories without getting in trouble with YouTube. Let's see. How do you differentiate being dumb from being stupid? So I sort of use dumb as it's just sort of the absence of intelligence, right? You don't get it, you don't get what to do, and you're sort of obtuse and you're thick. Whereas stupid, you are doing things that it's like, what on earth made you think that was a good idea? So when I was in Turkey, I went overland to the Republic of Georgia, and the wiki travel site thingy said that the bus will meet you on the other side so you can leave your luggage on it, which makes no sense if you think about it, because you need to go through customs. And so I left all my luggage with my computer on the bus. And the guy called after me, like, and I waved him off. And then I was like, wait a second. If he's telling me to do it, and I looked and no one else had left their luggage. And so I grabbed my luggage, but I very nearly lost my luggage because and the bus did not meet me on the other side. So I had to take a city bus because I trusted what Wiki Voyage was saying, right? And like, this is something where, like, someone who is dumb is not going to do that, right? Someone who is dumb is going to be like, yeah, I don't trust, I'm not going to leave my luggage unattended on this bus, right? Um, but whereas I was sort of stupid, I was credulous to the point, this isn't quite the same thing, this is more about being credulous than being stupid. But I was just like, oh yeah, the Wiki Voyage says it, so I will, presumably I can do this. And no, that was a dumb thing to do that fortunately I didn't do, but I came close to doing it. Thank you. Fantastic says, love my content. And I mean, I use some of these words idiosyncratically, but I have, since I was a teenager, I've been using stupid to mean sort of actively idiotic, as opposed to dumb is sort of passively stupid, or like it's passively foolish, right? It's like not really getting what you're trying to do. Whereas stupid is like, it's believing stuff and following up on it that if you really thought about it, it's like, why would you ever think that? But then it's, you have a reason and you don't really investigate the reasons for the reason, if that makes sense. Or the reasons for having those reasons, the reasons for thinking they're plausible. Yeah, so I'm from New England, so Western Massachusetts, and so I lived there most of my life. And then I live in Texas now, and I've lived in Texas for almost a dozen years at this. No, almost no. Let me see. For actually almost exactly 11 years at this point. And then I lived in Korea, and I had a job in Korea for a little under a year in Daegu, which is the third largest city in Korea. And that when I got fired from that job because the guy who hired me took a job at a college, and then they just promoted on seniority the next most senior person, who was an English woman who I had been constantly annoying without realizing it, because I'm, again, autistic. And then I stepped on the toes of a Korean coworker who told my boss that every single student in the classes we shared had complained about me as a result. And my boss then spent 4 hours arguing with the owner of the company, who really liked me, until she wore her down to agree to fire me. And then I asked the Korean manager, because one of those classes I shared, like, the students loved me and they said that like I was their favorite teacher they'd had. And I asked her, and she said, no, you really have had no more complaints than like any of the other teachers. But the English teacher, and I think the thing is, the Koreans had changed the law, so she had a new teacher from South Africa she was really excited about hiring, and then like they changed the law and they couldn't hire her, and I think she was kind of pissed, and I kind of wonder if she was hoping maybe if she fired me she could bring in the South African. But anyway, clearly, like, I gave her the opportunity because first of all I annoyed her, like, just the questions I asked, so that she was ready to fire me, and then I annoyed this Korean coworker who then made this complaint that was pretty clearly not true, because again, one of those classes the students loved me, the other one they liked me, that wasn't the same degree of, and then I confirmed with the Korean manager, like, oh no, like you have had no more complaints than like any other teacher. But I got fired from Korea, so I was there less than a year. So yeah. So dumb is blissful ignorance, and stupidity is when you could do better. But you could do better if you stopped to think about it. Yeah, but I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Or maybe blissful cluelessness would be slightly better. So do you practice your vocabulary much? For the most part, no. It just comes from like reading and stuff. Like I have been wanting to use the word deracinate, like deracinated, more, because I think it's a useful word. But because I'm not used to using it, I just keep not using it where it's relevant. And that sort of shows like I might eventually work it into my vocabulary, but it's going to take a while. Most of what I use, I just picked up somewhere and I started using it from context. Tell me more about my project, finding connections between books, please. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Sorry. Thank you. Loving the vids. I could maybe answer the question about finding connections to the project, but I'm not sure in this context what that is. Let's see if I find another good passage from Idries Shah. Here's a good one. Change everything. If it were possible to do without food, there would be people who would urge its abolition. If one could live without eyes with any degree of comfort, there would be people who claim they were the root of all evil. If time could be abolished, there would be people trying to get it done on the grounds that we must have to change and not stick to old-fashioned errors. One second, I'm gonna. Okay. So let's see. So you preferred books to studies because you had some project about books. I don't remember when I said that or what I said. Sorry. It sounds interesting. You can link two books that seem unrelated. Yeah, although it's not something I can do like intentionally. It just happens. One book I want to talk about more that I haven't is Arthur Koestler's The Act of Creation. And this one, fortunately, is still in print. But sort of a central idea of it is the idea of by association, of like connecting and seeing the connections between two domains that most people don't see. And for me, and I think for a lot of people like me, there's a tendency to do that a lot. And I think so. The interesting thing is like my processing speed is very slow. And it's because I think I'm looking at like a lot of possible connections in the possibility space before settling on one. But then I make a lot of connections, and most of them are just like random noise that aren't really like the joke that got me temporarily banned from Twitter. Like I knew it was not very funny. It was just like stuck in my head, and I wanted to make it. And I didn't think it was going to get me banned from Twitter for making it because it sounded like spam. But it was, if all you have is a hamburger where everything sounds like a meal, like that's not profound. It's not very funny. It's just my mind makes those kind of by associations all the time, and most of them are just not funny and interesting. And then it becomes a question of figuring out which of the ones that I have made are actually interesting and worth talking about. Let's see. What book do I think taught me the most? If it's you're asking about specific facts, it would be hard. It's like a lot of books have taught me a lot of facts. Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb sort of just completely transformed my worldview. In terms of books, and then, I mean, where'd I put it? Here we are. Reflections by Idries Shah. Like I mentioned, I read this over half a dozen times, mostly initially because it has these little small chapters that are good for like waiting rooms and stuff. But I've realized like it has been profoundly useful in terms of my thinking. And I sort of use the Zhuangzi and the Liège in a similar way, although I don't read those in waiting rooms. So I would say probably like the best candidates of books that have taught me the most would be either Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, because it fundamentally like changed my entire worldview, or Reflections by Idries Shah, because like it has a lot of these little observations that I keep thinking about sort of chewing on how to apply. I'm realizing I'm halfway to like using this book and the two Taoist texts, the Zhuangzi and the Liège, like Christians traditionally use the Bible. Let's see. So sounds interesting. You can link two books that seem unrelated. Oh, I already got that one. Serious question. How hard is it to write a book with no experience? It depends on the person, and it depends on the kind of book you're trying to write. There are stories of people who never wrote a book in their life, never tried, and they read something like, I can do this, and they like cranked out sort of like a bestseller by sort of doing something very formulaic. And if you're the kind of person who can do that, then it's going to be very easy to write a book with no experience. Conversely, like if you're the kind of person who thinks deeply about things, wants to create a work of art, and is always in your head, it's going to be, even with experience, it's going to be more difficult for you to write a book than it's going to be for the person who deconstructs the bestseller formula and then writes, dozens of those books starting with no experience. Cognitive bias goes across intelligence levels, so I would define this stupid. I think cognitive bias is only stupid when it goes against your actual interests and what you want out of life. And so for people who I think are genuinely sincere about what they want, their values, and then advocate and do things that go against them, I think even though it is self-serving, it's still kind of stupid, right? But then for people who, and likewise, if you're trying to do something and cognitive bias is stopping you and it's blocking you from doing what you want to most successfully. Good morning, Michael. Hi, nice to see you. So cognitive bias, if it's stopping you from either getting the most out of your life or living according to your values, I would agree that it's kind of stupid. But I think a lot of cognitive bias basically serves to advance the interests of people who don't really have underlying values, and it gives them what they think they want out of life. And in that case, I'm not sure that it's necessarily stupid, although it can certainly sound stupid to the people who it's not benefiting them to be so obtuse, right? I'm sure most people here have probably heard the quote about, right, it's hard to get a man to understand what his job depends on him not understanding, right? That's not these people being stupid, right? That's them making their lives easier by not doing something, that would make them put their necks out for no benefit to them. So let's see. Any tips for see connections other people don't see? People brought problems to you and you solved the problem when no one else could. Yeah. And that's the thing is at a big company. So I was not able to reapply for my own job because of a clerical error, because they put my job, they accidentally put it 3 pay scale grades above mine, and I could only apply up to 1 pay scale grade above mine. And so I don't know necessarily if I would have, even if I could have reapplied for my own job, I would have been not laid off, because I was just sort of basically someone who would solve problems other people couldn't, but I didn't have one big thing that I was known for, which when they did the reorg, they were sort of trying to prioritize getting people in roles that would sort of match their one big thing. And the people I know who are successfully full-time employed and happy with their career, who I relate to, they tend to be, they got jobs at small companies where the small companies recognize the value of having a generalist who could do this kind of, okay, no one else knows what to do with this, so we'll give it to you. Whereas at a big company, there's more of a thinking, we have enough specialists, that will solve all the problems. We don't really need generalists. So watch your videos for a while. What made you choose to work in Asia? Would you go back again? So I noticed early on, I often related to foreigners better than Americans, because foreigners tend to not make assumptions about what you should be doing and then judge you for not meeting neurotypical standards. And then sometime after I was diagnosed with autism, my parents took me to see this guy, Stephen Shore, speak, who was an early autism advocate guy. And he married a Chinese woman because, as he talked about in his memoir or biography, he found it easier relating to foreigners than to his own culture. And I'm yeah, that sort of fits me too. And so my original plan was I was going to go live in Wales, and I was going to be a writer when I was going to live in Wales. And then I sort of thought about, after we saw Stephen Shore speak, I read his book, and I'm I don't think Wales is foreign enough. I think I should be possibly move to a country that is more foreign. And so because I do find it easier to relate to I don't think I really notice a big difference between relating to Americans versus relating to English people or Australians or Canadians. But I notice more of a difference relating to, say, continental Europeans, and then more of a difference still relating to mostly I was reading either Latin Americans or East Asians and a few Indians. So I was and then when I learned about, got interested, I'm okay, I want to go to Turkey. That's my goal, is I want to live in Turkey. But then, when I graduated college, getting a job abroad, especially in Turkey, was not easy. And I'm open to other countries. I'd be willing to live in Indonesia or Vietnam or Uzbekistan or Mongolia, which were all places I applied for jobs, and Russia at the time too, actually, this was after the invasion of Georgia, but before the invasion of Ukraine. And so I ended up not like I got close to getting a job offer in Indonesia, but the Indonesian government for visas, they want you to have a degree in either, I think it's English education or applied linguistics. And I'm like, well, my degree is applied linguistics, but it didn't say applied linguistics on it. And they were like, okay, well, first, we'd never brought anyone in who had anything other than an English degree. And second of all, it doesn't say applied linguistics. We don't want to go through the process and risk it. So I didn't get that job. And so I ended up, I went to Korea just because that's where it's easier to get jobs, at least at the time. Like that, Korea and China were the two places it was easy to get jobs, like teaching English if you didn't have a master's degree. And I had an interest I've had a long-standing interest in the Korean language. We went to China in 2002, and I was fascinated by, like, I learned a little bit about the Korean language, and I'm fascinated by that and the Korean alphabet. And then I learned there was a psycholinguistic study on Korean. So in English, we either put things like in or we put things on, right? Korean has words for you put things on loosely, you put things in loosely, or you put things together tightly. And so like putting a ring on your finger or putting a candle in a candlestick holder would be the same word. And that is, I believe, kita. And then in and on, like loosely and tightly, are neta and nota. And these are verbs. So like and so it's not like, I don't think they have prepositions. They have like verbs for like put something to combine with the prepositional function. And they did a psycholinguistic study, and I forget how it was exactly. Basically, it did show that like Korean children process the idea of putting things tightly in and tightly on as being more similar to each other than putting things loosely in or loosely on, while English speakers process putting things tightly on and loosely on and together, and tightly in and loosely in together. But I still, like, Korea was it was walkable. The cities itself were beautiful, but I really don't like I like traditional Korean culture is interesting, but modern Korean culture, like the hyper corporatist sort of cyberpunk dystopia, I did not like. Let's see. Anyways, at this point I've thought about like doing the digital nomad thing. At this point, I am I'm committed to staying in the United States. And a big part of it is like my top country that I was thinking I would want to go to is Peru. And then Peru a couple of years ago so in the 90s, there was this huge outbreak of like political violence with the Shining Path. And then there was a smaller one, but it was still enough that it's like, because I would want to live in like rural Peru, like not in one of the big cities. And I'm like, this is telling me like you could have another Shining Path like outbreak, and if I was a foreigner living in a rural area, I would be one of the first targets. And I'm like, it does not seem like a good idea to live in Peru now. And after that, I'm like, okay, I'm sort of committed to, I'm gonna, for a number of other reasons, I'm gonna try to make things live in the U.S. So at this point, the only way I would consider like moving to another country probably would, short of like complete collapse of the U.S. into dictatorship or anarchy, would be if like I meet someone who's like fall in love with and I'm going to marry her and it's like I'm moving to her country, would be the only situation I would see doing it. But my preference is to stay in the US, probably, marry an American, and figure out how to make that work here. One of the reasons I want to stay here is that it is easier to make self-employment work in the US than it is in most developed countries. Let's see. Enjoy listening. Thank you. Do I play tabletop games? No. I've never done tabletop role-playing games. I have done German-style games a little bit when I was younger, but what I really, really like are those board games with the 60-page rule books, like representing some historical area of history, and at the strategic level specifically, because you have both the tactical and I don't really like the tactical ones. I like the strategic ones. And so I played a lot of those. And of course, it was hard to find anyone to play them against. I did find one. My classmate's father. My father knew him and mentioned he likes these games, so I played a game with him once, but I beat him at it, and he clearly did not like that, especially because I beat him at it by doing weird things that were historically inaccurate. So this was a World War I game, and I fended the British off Gallipoli by sending the Bulgarians in, and I harassed the British in Egypt by sending Ataturk to Libya, which are things that would not have happened in the historical context, but I was focused on the mechanics of the rules and not his history, and it was annoying him. So I think the combination of I won, and I won by doing annoying historical things that no real history buff would have done. He did not want to play any more board games with me after that. So I mostly played these games. And then I had a friend who I played a game about the 30 Years' War with once, but after that he was like, yeah, this was fine, but I don't want to play any more of these games. It was kind of tedious for me. So I mostly played these games against myself. And it's funny because what you find is most of these games now have explicit rules for how to play these games against yourself, because there's so many people in my situation, right, who they like these games with the 60-page rule books, but nobody else wants to play them. And so you play them against yourself. And it's funny too, because video games, computer games, my father tried to get me into computer games when I was a kid. And the only ones I really liked were I liked SimCity, Sim Farm, Roller Coaster Tycoon, Civilization games, and Your Producer Marcellus 4. And my friend was like, the games you like are basically like a list of the video games that people who don't like video games like. Well, it's really more, it's the video games for the people who like board games with 60-page rule books. Anyway, so religion versus postmodernism. You're just a brain being programmed by the world. So I am religious, but it's not necessarily conventionally religious. I'm a Quaker. I'm not a Christian Quaker, and increasingly, again, I say I'm Taoist, is I think sort of the best representation of my worldview when it comes to theism. At the same time, I am a materialist in that I think consciousness comes out of the brain and evolution, but I don't think that's incompatible with there is some sort of higher force sort of ordering the world. I don't know if this force is I would call it the divine, or I might also call it the Tao or the way, right? I don't know if it is conscious. I don't know. I would suspect it is, if it is intelligent, it is intelligent in a way that is so far beyond our comprehension we can't even begin to think about how it would think, basically, if that makes sense. And so the question is, I also don't know if this force is a result of the physical universe or the cause of the physical universe, or they're intertwined, or if it's in the state it's at. The question of whether it's the result or the cause of the physical universe is a meaningless question, asking, I don't know, asking, asking, is orange 3 or square? Equivalent to sort of that sort of meaninglessness. Let's see. So it's self-selecting to other outgroup preference people, not other countries. Sorry, I'm not sure what I was saying at the time, so I'm not sure what that's in reference to. There's Indonesia. Hi. Oh, Sukashita Yermi, are you from Indonesia? That does kind of sound like a... Although usually most Indonesians, don't you have one? No, I guess no. Some Indonesians have one name, but Joko, what's his face, has two. So it does sound like an Indonesian name. Happy birthday to your father. Thanks. Happy birthday to you, Waterford. My wife is Chinese. People are the same everywhere. Nations are different, but people are generally the same in spite of it. Oh, that's interesting. So reading the parable of the prodigal son through the lens of autism. Is it necessary to have a framework or background before reading Reflections? So Reflections is by Idris Shah. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the book I was recommending, is Anti-Fragile. And I think I would think Anti-Fragile, I think at different points you might get different things out of it, but I think it's a book that any reasonably educated person could get into and get a lot out of immediately. Numinous Path, Shining Path in Peru. Yeah. Have you read Inre Lakados? No, but I have some of his books, and I actually was confusing him with what's his face, because I was mentioning, someone was asking me about, I don't know if it was about Inre Lakados or if it was about someone else, but there is the guy who was Paul Feyerabend's interlocutor, Laszlo something, and I was thinking they were asking about that, and I'm like, yeah, I have his books, and I realized, oh no, I have Inre Lakatos books. At least I have two of his books, the 2-volume thing that I think he's best known for, but I haven't read it yet. I think, it's who you're assuming. I think I keep forgetting his name, so I might be confusing it again. I might actually is it a Hungarian? Because that actually sounds like it could be Greek, in which case it's, no, I haven't. Actually, let me just look this up, Inre Lakatos, and see if, because I don't want to get up again yet. I had to get up earlier because I forgot to set my AC to stay on temperature that's going to be comfortable upstairs, and so I have it set to be comfortable downstairs, like on a schedule, and so it was getting hot, but it's comfortable now, so I don't need to. Okay, so yeah, Hungarian, bridge the words, works of Popper and Kuhn. Okay, yeah, I think this is the guy whose works I have. Let me see if I can find his best known books and confirm. Stanford Encyclopedia. Oh, here we are. Wikipedia. Wikipedia usually has a list of famous works. Okay, so Paul Feyerabend did not like him. Interesting. Because I got him because I mistook him for Paul Feyerabend's friend, like interlocutor, and then I realized different Hungarian guy, different name actually, but was Laszlo something. Well, okay. Proofs and Refutations. Okay, yeah, I think this is the book I have. So, yeah. Although it's 2 volumes, the one I have. Okay. Okay. Thanks, Daniel. Nice talking to you. Let's see. And just catching back up. So map gaming, yes. I don't like games that are played on maps. I found them to just be unbalanced in a way that can't be fixed. You should play Lisboa. Okay. We look that up. Curious. I will say, Amazon has been pushing a game that looks potentially interesting hard on me called Botany. I don't know. Have you played that, Allison? Have you? It's an expensive game. I don't have anyone to play with, so I haven't bought it, but it does look intriguing. It's about like building up plant collections. Oh, let me see. Lisboa is. Oh, wait, because that's just Portugal, so it's not giving me the game. Okay, so this is about rebuilding Lisbon. That definitely sounds interesting. Yep. Let's see. Hi to Jacob in Germany. So Ken Wilber. So my father talked a lot about Ken Wilber, and I read, it was either A Theory of Everything or A Brief History of Everything, and I keep linking when I reference the book, Theory of Everything, but I think it might actually, Brief History, I think it might actually be Theory. I need to actually check that. But I learned from him about spiral dynamics, and then I went and I read the original book. And I've mentioned, when I've talked about spiral dynamics, I always mention pretty much that, because everyone learns about spiral dynamics from Ken Wilber. Like even I learned about it indirectly because I learned about him from my father, and my father learned about it from Ken Wilber. And so the original spiral dynamics, warm colors are basically focused on agency motivations and cool colors on communion motivations. And Ken Wilber thought this was unimportant and like organized. The original spiral dynamics is unaesthetic. And so he reorganized, like he uses colors that are more aesthetic, but he mostly calls them by level names. And I think having the colors and that color scheme makes sense. I haven't read anything else aside from that one book. I tried reading Religion of Tomorrow, which my father had, and it was tedious. And I have Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality, and I would like to read that. I've heard good things about it, but it's not high on my TBR. So basically, my opinion of Ken Wilber is he seems interesting. I mean, he's right about sort of the all quadrants, all levels sort of idea, I think. But mostly he's relevant to me because he introduced me to the original spiral dynamics, which I'm relying on more because he took a few things out, but the thing I'm really annoyed by again is taking out the color factor, which I think is sort of important. Do I have transcripts of my vids on Substack? No, I'm not scripting my videos, so like YouTube will do automatic transcripts, but I assume you can get it. If you can't, I can. But the thing is, like, YouTube transcription isn't great, and I'm not scripting them. I don't want to manually go through and like write down every word I said, right? But I do have on Substack. So I wrote several scripts that I never recorded because I stopped doing scripted videos. And one of those was talking about The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And that one I didn't record because it would have taken me like 20 minutes like for the final video. And that would have meant generally took about 3.5 times as long, like from when I was doing certain videos of recordings. I kept getting stuff wrong and repeating it and like coming back to it. Would have been sitting there for well over an hour, and then I'd have to edit all that down, and I just did not want to do that. And so when I did my video on the righteous mind, I put it up on Substack and I linked to it. And I also, this wasn't quite a script, but when I did my video on intersectionality, I also wrote an essay sort of explaining my thoughts on the topic in more detail. So I sometimes do have complimentary posts, and one of them is a video script, but no, I don't have scripts on Substack, transcripts on Substack. Spiritual, maybe, like there's definitely kind of person who would be described as not religious but spiritual, but I see, like, for me, a lot of the value in religion is in the religious community and being involved in a living, continuously transmitted tradition. I joked to people before that I'm not spiritual, I'm religious, but I am, like, I think I'm spiritual in the sense of, like, I have a deep appreciation for, like, nature and stuff in the sense of the sacred, but I'm definitely not the kind of person who's not religious but spiritual. Like, I see the value in religion more on the religious side in terms of learning from the received tradition, like the living tradition, than I do on the whole sort of individual spiritual side, if that makes sense. More interested in reading than watching. Yeah, sorry, people are generally less interested in reading what I write than listening to what I have to say. So or part of it could just be YouTube as a better discovery algorithm. So I am obviously very, like, that's what I've been mostly doing. And I do have stuff that I'm writing, but it's not going to be the same as my videos. And also, I feel like the different modalities work well for different stuff. Like the video is good for me. Like I do best, like developing my ideas, if I can have a conversation with someone who can follow me and sort of bounce stuff back and forth and critique my ideas. And then I've realized I do next best if I'm explaining it to someone, like even if they aren't immediately following me, but they're sort of like listening. And I realized I've started like recording YouTube videos like that as I'm talking to people, just a delayed constant people who are listening. And there was a conversation, but of course, for a number of reasons, I'm not reliably reading comments anymore. But uh, anyways, where was I? Sorry, I forget what I was. Oh, listening and watching. Yes. Yeah, I feel like Substack is better for generally either different kinds of prototypes for stuff that's like not stuff my audience and YouTube would be interested in, or for stuff where I'm really trying to work out all of the wrinkles. Whereas in my videos, I'm just not working out. I'm just getting at the general idea. So let's see. But that's like synesthesia. So I actually never considered the possibility that I might have synesthesia until I realized Nassim Nicholas Taleb says that he does. And then the way he described it, I'm like, this is not sort of, because like, I don't know anyone here. Do you watch Redeemed Zoomer? Probably, yeah, because I realized like I'm in a space that is sort of like a heterodox intellectual space focused to some degree on sort of the problems of modern society. And I feel like from what I can tell, there's probably fewer than 200 channels with more than like 5,000 subscribers in this space, like this entire space. And a lot of them show up my overlap. Redeemed Zoomer has not, but like people who watch my channel have often, when I talk to them, have often heard of him. Anyways, he has synesthesia, in which case, like it is for him, like every Christian denomination has a specific color associated with it. And that's why he does the colors them the way he does. I don't have that. That's more of a stereotypical synesthesia, but I do have, and I wrote a blog post on, there are several things I have that seem to be synesthetic in nature, and which I think relate to how I can remember things better than a lot of people. Because one of them is it's sort of similar to the memory palace, but it's more flexible and not at all intentional. Let's see. So some Chinese guy on YouTube recognized the Tao originally only meant stuff like night follows day and day follows night. The seasons follow each other in the cycle. That I have no idea, honestly. I'd have to probably see the video to even judge. Pardon me, I'm used to live stream chats with low latency. Yeah, sorry, I talk a lot before I like catch up on what people are saying. But yeah, I assume you're saying yes, yes, and say you're from Indonesia. Where in Indonesia are you from? The job I applied for was obviously Jakarta, because that's where all the jobs in Indonesia, like they're Jakarta or Surabaya, pretty much. But I think there was a couple in Solo, and I think if I was going to live in Indonesia, that would be seemed like probably the best place to live in Indonesia is Solo. So let's see. Lakatos is associated with Feyerabend. Lakatos is for method. Feyerabend is against method. Yeah, so I had a 2-day spiral dynamics course years ago. Nobody I work with even knew what it is. Yeah. I think the thing about spiral dynamics is that the people who tend to get to yellow and turquoise, either they are people who are really good at implementation and they're focused on that and they don't really worried about the organization stuff, or they have a hard time rising in the organization at all. So the people who would, to see the value of spiral dynamics, I think you generally have to be at yellow or turquoise. And you'll see a lot of people who are clearly at typically blue or orange who they like it because they're like, oh, we can rank people and like organize. And it's no, that's not the point. And so if organization were to try to use it in like a blue or orange way, it would not be very useful, and it's less comprehensible than similar frameworks that would be like simpler but probably more immediately useful. And then if you're at yellow or turquoise, you're either getting stuff done and not worried about organization, or you're not rising in the hierarchy to care about it, would be my guess. So on spiral dynamics, was there a framework that made you go from orange to green, or multiple things that caused it? So I think going from orange to green, a lot of it was the combination of living abroad and just realizing, like, especially in Turkey, like a lot of people just think about things often very differently, but it's still like you realize, oh, it's still like a valid and coherent way of thinking about things, combined with like a lot of the stuff that I sort of learned after the Trayvon Martin shooting in 2014. And so that was a gradual process. Like blue to orange was catastrophic and almost traumatic, and or green to yellow had to happen twice, once for epistemology, once for morality, and both kinds were kind of stressful and traumatic. The other transitions have happened much more like, well, actually, no, I think generally going from communion from cool colors to warm colors is kind of traumatic. Because if I'm right that I'm starting to explore coral now, that is the result of realizing that, like, again, I clung on tenaciously to individualism and egalitarianism sort of as I learned them. And when I had to admit, no, I really can't sustain these beliefs as I held to them anymore, that was not as upsetting, but it's certainly upsetting, and I'm still figuring out the implications of it. Yep, Jacob. So, hi from Germany. Hi. Where in Germany are you, by the way? There's 2 places in Germany I really, really want to go. They are the Stuttgart, the William Meine Botanical Gardens and Zoo, and the Walsrode Vogelpark in northern Germany, I think in like the Hanover area. There might be other places I want to visit too, but I definitely want to visit those 2 places. If you haven't figured out, I'm a big bird person. So there are clear, like, sort of discrete changes, but they are often sort of, it's a gradual process, and they do talk about that in the original book. And I think Ken Wilber sort of loses a lot of that in his, again, he has to simplify it in order to integrate it into his wider theory. But I do think he could have kept the warm and cool colors without losing anything. But the talking about how the transition is kind of complicated, like that is, I think, like 3 chapters in the book, and that would not be something he could have necessarily kept without like taking up too much space in his own book. Hang on, did you? Oh, I see. Your question came twice. Went through twice. Yeah, okay. Where did I put the? Okay, so I need to cover the computer. Let me see. Sorry, I'm looking for. Oh, there we are. Right up here. Okay, fine. case I need it again. Let's see, let me find another. Here, here's a good one. So, lying. Look at the phenomenon of lying and its relationship to fools. Fools lie to explain or conceal their foolishness. If it is not a remedy, but they use it. Liars, again, are fools because a lie may be found out, and gambling fools are not different from the ordinary kind. The liar fools himself that he will not be found out, and the fool fools himself that his lie will cover his folly. It is not easy to avoid being a fool. It is possible to realize that one has been one. The remedy is not lying. Again, it is possible to realize that one has lied and to avoid it. Foolishness and lying being so much of a continuum, being truthful can help towards being less foolish. It is for this reason, because it is constructively useful, that traditional teachings have stressed the need to tell the truth and be as truthful as possible. Truthfulness means being efficient, effective. Lying is an attempt to make inefficiency into its opposite. This is why all forms of self-deception are lying, and the person who foolishly cannot see the truth can approach it in practice by avoiding, at least for a start, some forms of lying. Many durable moralistic teachings are specific and effective exercises gone wrong. Hi, a cool game, Kana. Thank you, Kanal. Sorry. Actually, has anyone here played Botany? That is again, Amazon was pushing it hard on me for a while, and I actually considered ordering it, and then I was like, well, Amazon is not offering a discount on this game, and they have a tendency to smash stuff up in shipping. And then again, it is I don't really have anyone to play it against, but I think it has rules for single player, and that is of the non-map game I'm aware of, it sounds sort of one of the more interesting. Let's see. I'm gonna adjust my sitting position a little bit. Oh, actually, speaking of games, so I mentioned in my video on the book destruction thing. Oh, okay. I have not played Botany. I like action games like Warhammer. 90s classic Captain Claw. For some reason, I think you might have played it. It does not sound familiar to me. Although it is funny. My father liked video games, like computer games, tried to get us to get into them. My brother did. I did not. And it's funny because so many people from the 90s have stories about they wanted to play Doom and their parents would not let them. My father tried to get me to play Doom when I was 10, and I was not interested. My brother got into it. Let's see. No one has further questions. I might end it soon, but I'm going to look for one or two more of these that are. I think I might have read this one last time, but I'm going to read it here. So once upon a time, people used to become established as authority figures and were respected for centuries, even thousands of years. And then came the age of debunking, which is still with us. People started to debunk almost as soon as a reputation had been built up. But there's another phase now. People are being debunked almost before they become famous. And it's funny because now we're at the phase of people are becoming debunked before they're famous. And there's a whole industry of people with 2,000 channels, debunking people with 200 channels, right, or vice versa. The title of this one's let's see. So, does AI cause existential panic? Do you mean for me? No, it doesn't. I think for some people it probably does. Let's start a debunking movement. I like that. Yeah, my position, I have a video, I think. No, I have a video debunking mostly social signaling, but I think I want to make a follow-up to that nothing is ever really debunked, because basically what you realize is, you guys probably heard the quote, right? I think it's all theories are false, but some are useful. I forget, was it Pauli who said that? Was it Wolfgang Pauli? I think it might have been. But anyways, no, it's economics. It's all models are wrong, some are useful. And so that's sort of like when framework's sort of a model of the world, right? And well, I think so. Debunking doesn't work because some people are socialists. So I think that you have to ask yourself, are they socialists because they believe that socialism is going to create greater prosperity or inequality, or are they socialists for other reasons? And going back to the rent control thing, like socialism has been tried like a few dozen times in different countries, and then they always, it's always, when it seems to be working, it's always, yeah, socialism is working, and then when it doesn't, it's this was not real socialism. Rent control has been tried all over the world, like a lot of cities, like many times. And you have cases like Minneapolis, St. Paul, where St. Paul has rent control and Minneapolis doesn't. And you would both expect it shouldn't work. Like it's pretty clear, like you can explain it simply in a way that socialism is harder to explain convincingly why you shouldn't expect it to work. And like you have hundreds of examples like showing that it doesn't work. And yet some of that, the reason, again, like 85% of Americans support rent control, and some of that could be rational ignorance. But some of it could be because the priority is, okay, all that I care about is that my rent is going to be lower next year. And in that case, if you're not moving, yeah, rent control is going to lower your rent for next year. And if, alternatively, again, it could be a lot of these people are like recognizing if you don't have policies like that, and there's your city people want to move to, you're going to have more people moving. It's going to be changing your city, and people don't like change. People don't like people changing their world. And so some of the people who say rent control will lower rent prices could be talking out of rational ignorance, but they could also be talking out of, no, it'll lower my rent prices for next year, which is what I care about. That is all I care about right now. Or it could be sort of a proxy for, I don't want people moving to my city and changing it, and it's going to make it harder for that to happen. So, and I think that's, I think, like generally, like nothing can ever really be debunked, because it just sort of, everything makes sense. I think the right question isn't, is this true or false? The right questions are, first of all, like what purpose would having, like under what worldview, under what framework would it make sense for this to be true, or at least a useful thing to believe? And then like, okay, like, and you can sort of work it out by, okay, the people who believe this, like what do they seem to want out of holding those positions, if that makes sense? And so you can't debunk stuff by saying like it's factually not according with what you're saying, because people are, for the most part, like what we say is not statements of fact, it's statements of not emotion. I mean, it is emotionally freighted, but like communication is about sort of like it's signaling a bunch of things at once. And so you can debunk things factually in the context of a specific framework, but if the people you're talking to don't share that framework, it's not going to do anything. And to convince people, you need to, as James, as Stephen Covey said, you need to try to understand to be understood. And that means you genuinely have to sort of figure out, under what circumstances would I believe what you believe? And then understand what purpose do holding these beliefs have? And you need to address like the underlying reason that people hold these beliefs, as opposed to showing them that whatever they're stating they believe is wrong under the framework you are operating under, if that makes sense. Sorry. What advice would you give to someone who was once a high achiever and fell into deep depression and now lacks that belief in themselves? Yeah, I get it. Did your situation, was that basically when you went from having a highly structured environment to an unstructured environment? Because that's a pretty common situation. And the answer is, I guess, really try small things that you are reasonably confident would work, like, and will give you sort of immediate feedback, and sort of try to build up your confidence in yourself and your own judgment from there, I think would be, at least immediately, that's the best advice I can give you. I'll think about if I can think of anything else. Michelle 404, hi, love your channel and have been enjoying your appearances and conversation around YouTube. I know you mentioned wanting to read more classics. Is there a title or author that stands out? Probably absolute top of my list of writers I really feel like would be most useful for me to read in terms of the classics is Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. The problem with that is I have, like, the vast majority of people recommend the Pivar, and I don't remember, like, his wife, her long Russian last name translation, which I have. I have the hardcover, and the text is obnoxiously tiny, and so I keep not wanting to read it. I've also heard people say, like, really only the Grand Inquisitor scene is, like, most difficult, because you'll see, like, there are two writers of fiction who, there are two writers of fiction who philosophy people reliably cite, which are Dostoevsky and Goethe. And so Goethe, it's obviously mostly about Faust. Dostoevsky, it's mostly about Brothers Karamazov, and I think also Notes from the Underground. And with Brothers Karamazov, mostly what philosophers are citing is the Grand Inquisitor scene, which I have read. So maybe I don't need to read it to get what's useful, but I still would like to read Dostoevsky. I think everybody's reading The Count of Monte Cristo and talking about how it's like, even though it's a long book, it's like constantly engaging and like easy to get into. So I should maybe read that. That's been high on my list for a while. Middlemarch is another one that's high on my list. I loved Silas Marner. Let's see. I've also, like, I want to read more literary fiction. So I guess when I say classics, I'm often talking about like classics of nonfiction, but I'm also reading a lot of those. But I want to read more, like, I want to read more Aristotle, for example, or Avicenna. But yeah, like, I want to read more literary fiction as well, like Life of Pi, The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak, The God of Little Things. Those are all high on my list. I would like to read Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. I mean, those are not classics so much as, I mean, they're more modern works. So let's see. So they're socialist because it allows them to exercise their authoritarian tendencies while presenting themselves as angels. For the leadership, I think this is often true, but you have to ask, why do people who have no chance of being in the leadership follow these people? Like, you think about Hassan Piker, like, that's obviously why he's doing it, right? But why do the people who follow Hassan Piker hold these views? You mentioned Trayvon Martin and the shooting makes you change to green. Can you expand on that? So basically, I was already sort of, I think, grasping at green because of living in Turkey and realizing, like, sort of how people think about things differently. But there's, like, one of the big things is about time, right? So in America, we are obsessed with punctuality, and you're supposed to always be a little bit early to not be late. Or, well, I think it depends regionally, right? I'm from New England, and I think that that is strongest in New England and like weakest in California. But in New England, like, very much, you should be early to avoid being late. In Turkey, people show up like whenever, and there's like, it's like you're not expected to be on time, but you also shouldn't expect people to be on time like within at least 15 minutes. And that ends up actually being, once you get used to, I can just sort of wait around with people and not be stressed about where is this person, like, when are they going to show up? And they'll probably show up, but they might be 15, even 20 minutes late. It becomes sort of, it's like, this is actually much easier for me to deal with, like, as a ADHD person who is time blind, kind of, than it is like the US version, right? And then back in the US, sort of what I learned is, like, that, at least, like, reportedly, like, Black people and things, like, you also meet middle-class Black people who are like, I haven't really had these experiences, right? But that Black people have lived experiences that are very different from white people even today. And, like, some of these examples about, like, experiences that I wouldn't have had. And then especially, like, shortly after that, I moved to Austin. And, like, in Austin, like, there are, like, payday loan places everywhere. And I don't know anyone who would take a payday loan, but I also don't know anyone who would feel like that was their last option, right? And I was thinking about, like, there's just this whole world of, like, perspectives that I don't see. And like I have assumed that like I see the world, my experience is the same because people were raised in sort of a similar climate, but it's really not. First of all, because I was raised in a rural area, and so like I got a lot of perspective from that people in cities don't have. And then because I'm autistic and I'm weird and I don't think about things like most people do, and I'm often talking past them, and so it's hard to explain. But it was sort of all of that sort of came together, like living in Turkey and then seeing this discourse on like the lived experience of Black people in America and some of these stories, and then moving to Austin and thinking about the lived experiences of like poor people in America. I think sort of explain that shift. Thoughts on Star Wars? I don't. What's your favorite? I do not watch Star Wars. My legal name, which I have never liked, and which I'm going to. My plan is I'm going to move to New Hampshire. And when I move to New Hampshire, I'm going to change it. It's a pain to change your legal name in Texas. It's a lot easier in New Hampshire. And so after my father died, I tried to change my name. I went by Arthur because in the US, you can call yourself any name you want. I went by Arthur for most of undergrad. And then I moved abroad and went back to my legal name. And then after my father died, I started going by Magpie. My legal name is Luke. And I got so many of the jokes to predict. And so I was very much, I was like, I hated that as a kid. And so I was never, like, I was very just averse to Star Wars because of that. Let's see. Have you thoughts on AI and entropy? I don't really have thoughts on it. I think it's an interesting, like a lot of what Nick Land says about cybernetics especially is interesting, but it's also, it's sort of so profound that it's like, I don't yet see the practical implications, but I feel like there's implications there. Let's see. Have I read Charles Pierce? I have not. I've maybe read one or two of his essays. I have a collection. I haven't, but yeah, I am very much. So I actually, I knew about pragmatism as a school because I read some like magazine article or something years ago about saying like people say that Americans have contributed nothing to philosophy, but that's not true. They've actually contributed pragmatism. And so I read that and that sort of put it on the back burner. And then I read William James Variety's Religious Experience. And then I go to an existentialist philosophy reading group. And I was like, the thing is, I'm not an existentialist. And so the guy who runs it, like one of his classmates comes to some of these and I was talking to him and I was like, well, what's the difference between existentialism and pragmatism? Because I think I might be a pragmatist, not an existentialist. And he's like, I really don't know. I think there's a lot of similarities, but I don't know enough about pragmatism to say. And then I was like, well, I bought William James' Pragmatism after, reading Variety's Religious Experience. And so I should read this. And it turned out to be shorter than I thought because it's like 2/3 of the book is pragmatism. And then the rest of the book is like various essays. And then I read a couple of essays by Peirce and Dewey. One or both of them. I don't remember which ones and by who. But yeah, I'm sort of been like, I've been pragmatist in William James in terms of like thinking about what model the world up makes most useful prediction. Like that's sort of what I've been doing all along, but it's helpful to see James articulating it, as well as the point that like everybody has sort of a philosophy we live by, but most people sort of don't know they have one and assume, okay, well, I'm just doing what makes sense because it's like a fish in water. You're not even noticing the water. If I read Infinite Jest, I think I've answered this one in previous live stream. I certainly answered in a video. I was trying to write a novel that I wanted to write. And the interesting thing is I was trying to write this to work out feelings I had that I've now sort of resolved, but I still kind of want to write it, but it's not nearly as pressing now that I know the answer to why I was trying to write it. But it was an alternate history novel in which South Africa becomes much larger, like early in its colonial history, and consequently, it is not as explicitly racialist as apartheid South Africa, but it is still very much a segregationist state. Only it's sort of justified as being based on class rather than race. But because it's such a large and important economy, much like China, the world can't really sanction and embargo it, despite. And then they release I actually don't know if I should talk about this one on YouTube, so I'll actually stop here. The point is I was trying to write this novel, alternate history novel, and I was bringing it to my science fiction fantasy writing group. And the thing is, I'm like, well, I was thinking about it as well. It's sort of science fiction, fantasy, right? It's speculative fiction, but like most of the writing group is people who like more conventional science fiction and fantasy. And the thing is, I like more conventional science fiction and fantasy, but I also like really both like literary science fiction and like weird experimental sort of philosophical stuff that is loosely science fiction or fantasy, like stuff that Jorge Borges writes. And most of the people in the group don't like either of those things. And so I was like, this was not actually the right place to be bringing a book like this. And most of the people are just like, I don't like this because it's not the kind of thing that I read, right? Because they want more standard narrative stuff. And anyway, but the one guy who really liked the book kept comparing it to Infinite Jest. And so I bought Infinite Jest to possibly read, but it's also like, so I'm trying to figure out like what are the niches that exist on BookTube, and I'm like, I don't fit into any of them. But one of the ones that I identified is sort of men reviewing like these modern literary fiction writers. So David Foster Wallace, Cormac McCarthy, Thomas Pynchon, and I like what they describe liking about these books does not sound like stuff I would like. Infinite Jest does sound like a book I might like, but it's also a big investment. And I actually have a video like these 3 red flag books. I own something like that on my channel where I talk about when I was doing my channel, I made 2 changes to the shelf that I have behind me in my craft room. One of them is I grabbed some tchotchkes from other parts of like most of my bedroom in order to have sort of stuff that's not just books behind me. And also, like if I had been started this channel a few years ago, I would have sent my bookshelves to Daniel Green to roast because he would complain about how much knackage I have. But now those are getting no views, so it's not really worth the effort. Plus, you have to like be in his server and like wait for him to like announce. Right? I'm not gonna do that. But anyways, the other thing. So I had the tchotchkes, and then I was like, the only book that is easily identifiable behind me that would mark me as being part of a specific BookTube like niche is Infinite Jest, and I have not read it. I don't know what I think, but it would mark me as being in sort of this modern like bro lit category that I'm not in, and so I pulled it and swapped it for my omnibus of Diana Wynne Jones' Dale Mark Quartet, which happens to be same size and same spine color. Let's see. I wish I knew how to read. Is that a joke, or is that like you don't know like how to get what you want out of reading? What's your favorite encyclopedic novel? Probably For Want of a Nail by Robert Sobel, and I will put that in the chat. Of course, I have some keys that are broken, so I'm going to Walt. By Robert Sobel. So this one is out of print, but at least when I got it, it was still pretty affordable, and I'm not promoting books in live streams. I'm going to like make the used books go up in price, because it's something I've noticed is like even relatively small channels, if it's an obscure book and they mention it, can like make out of print books go up in price. That I've seen it with other channels. But anyways, so let's see. So I want to know what that helped you figure out. I don't. Oh, I see. Yeah, the alternate history I was writing. Yeah. So basically, I was critiquing the logic of managerialism, and I was critiquing the behavior that Musa al-Harbi describes as symbolic capitalists in his book We've Never Been Woke. And when I read that book, I was like, oh, this book was trying to criticize this exact thing through fiction that Musa al-Harbi was criticizing in this book through nonfiction. What was the book that you mentioned on AI and entropy that seemed useful but still far out? That's Xenosystems by Nick Land. And so that's a collection of his blog posts. And so he had a blog, Xenosystems, which is now down. Some of them are available on the Internet Archive, I guess. And then this book curated what he thought were his best blog posts, sort of organized thematically. And so because he was one of the founders of Neo-Reaction, so he has a couple of chapters on Neo-Reaction, and then he has a couple of chapters on cybernetics. And I find the cybernetics chapters to be the more interesting and useful ones. And then let's see, so Yeah, I like fiction. I talk about it a lot less on my channel because, well, videos about science fiction and fantasy tend not to do well, and I don't read a ton of literary fiction. I do actually, for a book club I'm in, I read this book, The White Tiger, and he has this idea of the rooster coop, and I want to talk about that probably. I was going to do a video, but now I started doing shorts, and I think I'd probably do a short. I will probably never try to read Ulysses. I'm definitely never going to try to read Finnegan's Wake. But yeah, I read a lot of science fiction and well, mostly science fiction. I had a period where I was trying to read more fantasy, and I found so I like the novella series of Sean and Maguire, so the Wayward Children series and the Singing Hills cycle by Nevo. And I like the novels of Lev Grossman, the Magician series, and Robert Jackson Bennett has like 3 different series now. But in general, like I haven't found many fantasy series that I have liked that much. I still like science fiction better. So I'm mostly fiction. I'm mostly reading science fiction. I try to read more literary fiction. I also have been meaning to read more mysteries. And at some point, I want to read thrillers. I feel like I should at least give reading thrillers a chance. And the obvious place to start is Jurassic Park. But people are complaining about the death of the mass market paperback. Jurassic Park has no trade paperbacks, and hardcovers are hard to find and expensive. And I don't like reading mass market paperbacks, so I haven't bought one yet. I was like, well, if I'm going to get a mass market paperback, I might get one cheap at Half Price Books. And I went in, and they're basically the same price used. They're like, it's $8 getting a new mass market paperback of Jurassic Park on Amazon. It's $6 getting a used one with like a bent up spine on a Half Price Books. And I'm like, I guess some people would do that. I definitely would not, but I don't really want to read the trade paperback, period. So I don't know. There's thrillers that have trade paperbacks or hardcovers, like affordably, that might be a better starting place than Jurassic Park. Thank you for making videos. Yeah, thank you, man. Let's see. Okay. Oh yeah, 3-body problem is great. Second one is also pretty good. Third one introduces some interesting ideas which he doesn't resolve, and I don't like the ending. I've called the ending of this book, like I've read several short stories, and I think maybe a couple other, 1 or 2 other books, but certainly several short stories that have sort of a similar ending that I call like the grand cosmic ending, and I don't like this ending. So it's like weird because again, there's ideas in the first half of the 3rd book that I like, so I wouldn't say read the first 2 books and then like skip the 3rd book, but I feel like the series is a little bit ruined by me not liking both. I don't like the ending, and also like he introduced some ideas that he didn't resolve. Like, for example, the question about how is like the importance of the difference between Western and Chinese style painting. That was never resolved, how it's relevant to the book, but it's an interesting observation. And I think that is like something a lot of people don't appreciate, is like a lot of the value in what you do is actually in figuring out what not to do. And it's funny that I say this, like, and I figure out this in terms of what I do, because I am a maximalist in terms of how I was going to turn the computer around and show you my bedroom, and then I realized, if it was just like the maximalist like stuff on my bookshelves, I would. But I also have huge piles of books stacked up on their like sides that I don't want to show you. That I'll tell you I do it. I don't want to actually show you. Let's see. I'll probably, depending if people have more questions, I'll either wrap it up in a few minutes or end of the hour. Let's see. Here's a good one. Raw materials. Listen to man. He thinks that he prizes himself above everyone else, and yet he treats himself and his fellows as the cheapest raw materials in the world. There's another good one. Hard and easy work. Prescribing hard work for the soft or easy work for the hardy is generally nonsense. What is always needed in any aim is right effort, right time, right people, right materials. that's you. You're treating people like the cheapest raw material in the world, or probably not. Not sure what you meant there, but okay. Apparently, you did mean that. Yeah, maybe try not to do that much. But okay. Any other questions? Wait, I'm pretty sure you'd be like me if you were born 20 to 30 years earlier. You're 8, or I'm 38. Or are you guessing I'm? Let's see. Okay. Well. I don't know. Try it and see. Person asked, if I made 1,000,000 clones of you and sent them out in the world, what would happen? It's actually slightly relevant to, I mentioned my favorite novel by my favorite writer, Jack Vance, which is not the same as my favorite novel, is his book Clarges. And something kind of like that happens. I won't spoil too much, but yeah. Okay. 24, but there's no chance I'd have gotten into books if I was born at any time in which video games existed. I mean, my father was trying to get me to play video games, and but I guess, yeah. I mean, that's basically the logic that Elon Musk is operating under, isn't it? Trying to pay all these women to bear his children, but only the sons. Which is actually similar to another Jack Vance novel, The Languages of Pow. Okay. Well, no more questions. Then thank you all. This was nice. I'll probably be trying to do these monthly going forward. I guess until interest tapers off, or until it gets to the point that I feel like I can't keep up and it's getting to be a chore. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Bye. Bye, everyone. If you have a question, I can answer quickly before I go, but I was just about to hit the end stream button. Or not. Okay. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you. Y'all have a good weekend.